Okay, picture this. What if Deku's quirkless childhood was actually just his past life memories being suppressed? And that past life, the freaking king of Hueco Mundo. I'm talking Baraggan Louis Sainbairn here, people. The guy who could literally age your existence into nothing, who made time itself his plaything. His senescentia was so disgustingly overpowered that he ruled an entire realm of death for centuries. Remember when he aged Soifan's Bankai like it was made of paper? Yeah, that level of broken. But here's the twist: instead of becoming another tyrant, our cinnamon roll Deku has to learn how to use these reality-warping powers to save people. Imagine trying to be a hero when your natural instinct is to command armies and your power literally turns things to dust. The internal struggle alone would be chef's kiss perfect. Hit that like if you're ready for some philosophical time manipulation madness. Alright, let's see how our boy handles having the memories of an immortal king. The concrete dust tasted like failure. Izuku Midoriya spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he stared up at the massive zero-pointer robot towering above him. Around the mock city, other examinees were already booking it in the opposite direction. Smart kids who understood that 3-story-tall death machines weren't meant to be fought, just avoided. But there was a girl trapped under some rubble about 20 feet behind the thing. His legs wouldn't move. Not because he was scared, okay, he was terrified, but that wasn't new, but because something felt wrong with his body. Off. Like he was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, or trying to remember a word that sat just on the tip of his tongue. "Move, you idiot," he whispered to himself, the same words he'd been repeating for the past 10 minutes of this practical exam. You wanted to be here, you wanted to prove you could be a hero without a quirk. The robot's spotlight swept across the street, searching for targets. In a few seconds, it would find the trapped girl. Izuku's feet finally unstuck from the asphalt. He ran, not toward the exit like everyone else. Straight at the robot, his ratty red sneakers slapping against broken concrete. The logical part of his brain, the part that had analyzed thousands of pro-hero fights and memorized quirk statistics, was screaming that this was suicide. Quirkless kids didn't fight giant robots. They ran, they hid, they found another way. But his body wasn't listening to logic anymore. The robot's cannon arm swiveled toward him, charging up with that high-pitched whine that meant very bad things were about to happen. Izuku leaped, both fists pulled back in the most basic, desperate punch he could manage. His right hand connected with the robot's chest plate. The world went quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or the comfortable quiet of his room. This was the quiet of things ending, of time itself holding its breath. Under his palm, the robot's steel began to change. The bright blue paint faded to gray, then to brown, then to the deep red-orange of rust. Bolts loosened and fell like raindrops. Joints seized with the grinding sound of metal aging decades in seconds. Izuku jerked his hand back, but it was too late. Cracks spread across the robot's chest like a spider web, and then it was crumbling, folding in on itself as if the years had finally caught up to it all at once. Pieces crashed to the ground around him, not the sharp, violent explosion he'd expected, but the quiet collapse of something that had simply gotten too old to keep standing. The silence stretched until someone in the observation room hit a buzzer, and suddenly the test was over. What the hell was that? Izuku spun around to find a spiky-haired blonde staring at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for aliens or really impressive magic tricks. Other examinees were climbing out of hiding spots, pointing and whispering. I don't know." The words felt like cotton in his mouth. "I don't have a quirk, I'm not supposed to, that was not no quirk," the blonde interrupted. His red eyes narrowed, and Izuku recognized him with a start. Bakugo, Katsuki Bakugo from his middle school. The same Bakugo who'd spent years telling him exactly how useless quirkless people were. Great. Just great, Kachan, I swear, I don't know what happened. Maybe it was some kind of, don't call me that. Bakugo stalked closer, his hands already starting to spark with tiny explosions. And don't lie to me, Deku, I know what quirks look like, and that thing you just did, that was a quirk. A chill ran down Izuku's spine that had nothing to do with the spring air, because Bakugo was right. Whatever had just happened, it had felt natural, like flexing a muscle he'd forgotten he had, but that was impossible. He'd been tested. Multiple times, the doctor had been very clear. 2 joints in his pinky toe, no quirk, sorry kid, better luck in your next life. All examinees, please report to the main building for processing, announced a voice over the loudspeaker. Around them, kids started moving toward the exit, but Bakugo didn't budge. You better figure out what that was, Deku, he said quietly. Because next time we fight, I'm not holding back just because I thought you were quirkless. He turned and walked away, leaving Izuku alone with the rusted remains of a robot that should have been in perfect condition. Izuku knelt and picked up one of the fallen pieces. It was light, brittle, like something that had been sitting in a junkyard for 50 years. When he pressed it between his fingers, it crumbled to powder. Somewhere in the back of his mind, something that felt like an old memory stirred. Stone walls, a high ceiling, the weight of something heavy and important sitting on his head. A crown. He dropped the metal fragment and stumbled backward, shaking his head hard enough to make his neck crack. That wasn't his memory. It couldn't be. He'd never been anywhere with stone walls except maybe a museum, and he'd definitely never worn a crown. Midoriya, he looked up to find a girl with short brown hair jogging toward him. The same girl who'd been trapped under the rubble. She looked fine now, completely uninjured, which was good because he'd definitely forgotten to check on her after the whole mysterious robot death thing. "Are you okay? You look kind of pale." "I'm fine," he said automatically, then realized how stupid that sounded. "I mean, I'm not hurt, physically, just confused." She tilted her head, studying his face with the kind of intensity that meant she was probably smart enough to see through his terrible lying. "About your quirk, I don't have a quirk. The robot that just aged 50 years in 5 seconds might disagree with you." Point taken. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he'd never been able to shake. "It's complicated. Most good things are." She stuck out her hand. "I'm Uraraka Achako, and thanks for saving me, by the way, even if you're having some kind of identity crisis about it." He shook her hand, careful to keep his grip light. What if whatever had happened to the robot happened to her too? But her hand stayed warm and solid in his, no aging or crumbling or any other terrifying side effects. Midoriya Izuku. "And I'm not having an identity crisis." Uraraka raised an eyebrow. "Okay, maybe a small one." They walked toward the main building together, joining the stream of exhausted examinees. Most of them looked like they'd been through a blender, which made sense considering they'd just spent an hour getting chased around by robots designed to test their limits. Izuku kept his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "So," Uraraka said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "want to talk about what's really bothering you?" "Not particularly." "Fair enough, but just so you know, most people don't look that scared after they've just pulled off something awesome." She was right, and that was the problem. He should have been excited, thrilled. This was what he'd dreamed about his entire life, having a quirk, being able to fight alongside heroes, maybe even getting into UA. Instead, he felt like he'd been handed someone else's clothes and told to pretend they fit. The processing went quickly. Name, address, emergency contact information, basic health questions. When they asked about his quirk, Izuku hesitated for a long moment before writing unknown decay type in the blank space. It felt like a lie, but it was the closest thing to truth he had. He was almost to the exit when someone called his name. "Young Midoriya, a word if you don't mind." Izuku's heart stopped. All Might, the actual All Might, not some poster or action figure, but the real symbol of peace, was walking toward him with that easy, confident stride that had inspired a million kids to dream of being heroes. Up close, he was even more impressive than in the videos. Taller, broader, with the kind of presence that made you want to stand up straighter just by being in the same room. "All Might, I mean, sir." "I mean," Izuku's voice cracked spectacularly. "How can I help you?" The hero's famous smile was warm but thoughtful. "I wanted to ask you about what happened during the practical exam. Quite impressive work with that 0-pointer. "Thank you, sir, but I'm not sure I understand what happened either." All Might clasped his hands behind his back, looking every inch the professional hero evaluating a potential student. "The observers noted some unusual readings during your encounter, energy signatures that don't match any known quirk classification." A cold knot formed in Izuku's stomach. "Is that bad?" "Not bad necessarily, but unusual." "Tell me, have you experienced anything like this before?" Izuku shook his head quickly. "No, sir, I've been quirkless my whole life. At least I thought I was. The doctors said." "Doctors can be wrong," All Might interrupted gently. "Especially when dealing with late manifesting or unusual quirks. What I'm curious about is how it felt to you." How it felt. That was the question Izuku had been trying not to think about. "Familiar," he admitted quietly. "Like remembering something I'd forgotten, which doesn't make sense because I've never done anything like that before." All Might nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he'd suspected. "Sometimes our bodies know things our minds haven't figured out yet. I'd like to keep in touch, if you don't mind. Help you understand what you're dealing with." "You mean, if I get into UA?" "Oh, you're getting in." All Might's grin was confident and somehow reassuring. "The question is what we're going to do with you once you're here." The train ride home was a blur of Tokyo scenery and racing thoughts. Izuku stared at his reflection in the window, looking for some sign of change, some evidence that he was different now than he'd been this morning. His green hair was still messy. His freckles were still scattered across his cheeks like someone had flicked paint at him. His eyes were still too big for his face, giving him a perpetual look of surprise. But when he looked closer, really looked, there was something else. A weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Like looking into a deep well and realizing you couldn't see the bottom. The apartment was empty when he got home. His mom was working a double shift at the hospital, so he went straight to his room and closed the door. His All Might posters stared down at him from the walls, bright and heroic and uncomplicated. Izuku sat at his desk and pulled out a notebook. Number 13 in his hero analysis series, though this one might end up being about something else entirely. He wrote the date at the top of the first page, then paused. What do I know? Robot aged decades in seconds. When I touched it felt natural, like breathing or walking decay type effect, but not like Shigaraki's disintegration, some kind of memory or dream about a crown. All Might says energy readings were unusual. What don't I know? Everything else? Izuku set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the city hummed with its usual evening energy. Somewhere out there, pro-heroes were patrolling, keeping people safe with quirks they understood and controlled. And somewhere in his chest, something that felt old and patient and powerful was waiting for him to figure out what came next. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the dream about the crown, but all he could catch were fragments. Stone. Shadows, the sense of looking down from a great height, and underneath it all, a voice that sounded almost like his own, but deeper. Older. Soon, it seemed to say, soon you will remember. Izuku opened his eyes and picked up his pen again. Question for tomorrow, who am I really? He had a feeling the answer was going to be complicated. The letter came on a Tuesday. Izuku stared at the UA envelope for a full 3 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to open it. His mom hovered behind him, practically vibrating with nervous energy as he pulled out the acceptance packet. Well, she asked, her voice pitched high with hope and worry. I got in. The words felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a foreign language. Hero course, Class 1A, his mom burst into tears, the happy kind, and wrapped him in a hug that probably would have cracked ribs if not for all those years of dealing with Bakugo's explosions. Izuku hugged her back, but part of his mind was still stuck on the robot from a week ago, on the way it had crumbled like ancient stone. He'd spent the past 7 days researching every decay-type quirk he could find online. Shigaraki's disintegration was closest, but that was violent, instant destruction. What Izuku had done was different, more like time itself had caught up to the robot all at once. The dreams hadn't helped either. Every night brought fragments of the same vision, a massive throne made of bone and shadow, the weight of a crown, and the absolute certainty that everything he could see belonged to him. But dreams were just dreams. Right. UA's campus was even more impressive in person than in the promotional videos. Izuku stood at the gates with his new uniform perfectly pressed and his nerves strung tight enough to play violin. Around him, other first-years were saying goodbye to their families, some with tears, others with confident grins. He'd already spotted Bakugo near the main building, surrounded by a small crowd of students who were probably smart enough to recognize explosive talent when they saw it. No surprise there, Koch-chan had always been magnetic, even when he was busy blowing things up. Midoriya. He turned to find Uraraka jogging toward him, her brown hair bouncing with each step. She looked excited and nervous in equal measure, which was honestly reassuring. At least he wasn't the only one fighting butterflies. You made it, she said, slightly out of breath. I wasn't sure. I mean, after what happened at the exam. Yeah, about that. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, a habit that was becoming more pronounced with each passing day. I still don't really understand what happened. Have you figured out anything else about your quirk? Not much. I've been doing research, but there's nothing quite like it in the databases. He didn't mention the dreams. Those felt too personal, too strange to share with someone he barely knew. They walked toward the main building together, joining the stream of new students. The hallways were buzzing with excited chatter as kids compared quirks and speculated about their new classmates. So then I told my dad, watch this, and froze the entire swimming pool. Apparently the engines in my calves can propel me up to 40 kilometers per hour. Family tradition, really. 4th generation flame user. Izuku listened with the same fascination he'd always had for quirk analysis, mentally categorizing and noting interesting combinations. But underneath the academic interest was a growing knot of anxiety. All these kids knew exactly what they could do. They had years of experience with their abilities, families who could offer guidance, established techniques to fall back on. He had a week of nightmares and a robot that had probably been scrapped for spare parts. Class 1A was on the second floor, in a room that looked more like a university lecture hall than a typical classroom. Izuku found a seat in the middle row, close enough to pay attention but far enough back to avoid unwanted attention. That plan lasted exactly 30 seconds. If you're here to socialize, you can pack up your bags and leave. The voice came from the front of the room, where a man in a black jumpsuit was emerging from what looked like a giant yellow sleeping bag. His hair was long and unkempt, his eyes tired in the way that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm Aizawa Shouta, your homeroom teacher. First things first, put on your gym clothes and meet me outside. We're doing a physical assessment." A girl with a black ponytail raised her hand. "What about the entrance ceremony, the orientation? Waste of time." Aizawa's expression was flat, unimpressed. UA is known for its freestyle educational system. That applies to teachers too. Now move. The assessment was brutal. Aizawa had them run through 8 different tests: 50-meter dash, grip strength, standing long jump, repeated side steps, ball throw, distance run, sit-ups, seated toe touch. Standard gym class stuff, except for the part where they were encouraged to use their quirks to enhance their performance. Izuku watched his classmates show off with a mixture of admiration and growing dread. A boy with engines in his calves, Ida, he thought, blazed through the 50-meter dash in just over 3 seconds. A girl with frog-like features cleared the long jump by what had to be 20 meters. Even Bakugo, predictably, launched a softball nearly 800 meters using controlled explosions. When it was Izuku's turn for the ball throw, he stood in the circle with sweaty palms and tried to figure out how to use a power he didn't understand for a test that had clear, measurable results. The ball felt normal in his hand. Round, slightly rough regulation weight, no different from 1,000 others he'd thrown in middle school gym class. But as he wound up for the throw, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. The metal fence surrounding the field. Strong, modern chain link that probably hadn't been installed more than a few years ago. What would happen if he touched it while using his quirk? The thought came from nowhere, carrying with it an almost overwhelming sense of curiosity. Not his curiosity, something older, more patient, like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. Izuku shook his head and focused on the throw. He could analyze his power later when he wasn't being graded on it. The ball left his hand with decent form but totally human velocity. It arced through the air and landed about 40 meters away, respectable for someone without a physical enhancement quirk, but nothing special. 46 meters, Aizawa called out, making a note on his tablet. His expression was unreadable, but Izuku caught something that might have been disappointment. The distance run was worse. Without super speed or enhanced endurance, Izuku had to rely on pure determination and the conditioning he'd built up through years of running away from Bakugo. He finished in the middle of the pack, lungs burning and legs shaking. "All right," Aizawa said once everyone had completed the tests. "Time for results." A holographic display appeared in the air, showing everyone's rankings from first to last. Izuku's heart sank as he found his name near the bottom, 20th out of 20 students. "By the way," Aizawa continued casually, "I lied about expelling whoever came in last. That was just a logical deception to make sure you gave your best effort." Relief flooded through the class, but Izuku barely heard it. His attention was caught by something else, a faint shimmer in the air around him, like heat distortion on a summer day. And the fence behind him was starting to rust. "Midoriya," Aizawa said sharply, "control your quirk." Every head in the class turned toward him. Izuku spun around to see the chain-link fence aging in a rough circle about 2 meters across, the metal turning brown and flaking away like old paint. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, decades of weathering compressed into seconds. I'm trying," Izuku stammered, but the aging effect was spreading. A few students backed away and he couldn't blame them. The air itself felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through honey. Time moved strangely within the field he'd somehow created, everything just slightly slower than it should be. And underneath it all, a sound that made his chest tighten with inexplicable recognition, the soft whisper of stone crumbling to dust. Respira. The word came from nowhere, carrying with it the weight of absolute authority. Not his word, but one he understood with perfect clarity, breath of death, the king's gift to his enemies. "Midoriya," Aizawa's voice was sharp with alarm now. "Shut it down," but Izuku didn't know how. The field was expanding, 3 meters now, creeping toward his classmates. A few more students backed away, and he caught sight of Uraraka's wide eyes, the fear she was trying to hide behind concern. Panic made everything worse. The aging effect accelerated, eating through the fence like acid through paper. His classmates were shouting now, some of them activating their own quirks defensively. Then something hit him from the side, not painful, just a strange tingling sensation that made his skin go numb. The field collapsed instantly, time snapping back to normal speed like a rubber band. Aizawa stood 10 feet away, his hair floating around his head and his eyes glowing red. "Erasure," he said simply. "Nullifies other people's quirks as long as I'm looking at them, useful for situations like this." Izuku looked around at the damage. The fence was shot, a perfect circle of rust and decay marking where his power had run wild. Some of his classmates were still staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed fear. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to, I don't know how to control it yet." Obviously, Aizawa's expression was unreadable. "We'll need to work on that. Everyone else hit the showers. Midoriya stay behind." The other students filed back toward the building, most of them giving Izuku a wide berth. He caught fragments of whispered conversations. Just like Shigaraki's quirk, dangerous to have in class, why would they accept someone who can't control their power? Only a few students looked back with anything other than wariness. Uraraka gave him an encouraging smile before disappearing through the doors. Ida paused long enough to offer a formal bow, respect for a fellow student, even one with a destructive quirk. And Bakugo. Bakugo was staring at him with those sharp red eyes, the same expression he'd worn after the entrance exam. Not fear or disgust, but something closer to recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd been expecting all along. When they were alone, Aizawa let his hair settle back into its normal state and his eyes returned to black. "Talk," he said simply. "I don't know what happened." The words tumbled out of Izuku faster than he could organize them. "I've never been able to do anything like that before. I was quirkless until last week, and now I'm aging metal and making the air thick, and I keep having these dreams about." He cut himself off before he could mention the throne room. That felt too personal, too strange. Dreams about what? Nothing, just weird dreams. Aizawa studied him for a long moment. "This field effect, have you experienced it before?" "Once, during the entrance exam. But it was smaller then, and I was touching the robot directly." "And you have no family history of similar quirks?" "None. My mom has weak telekinesis, and my father breathes fire." "Nothing like this." Aizawa made a note on his tablet, then looked back at Izuku with something that might have been sympathy. "Late manifesting quirks are rare, but not unheard of. Usually they appear during periods of extreme stress or life-threatening situations. The entrance exam would qualify." He paused, considering. "What's concerning is the apparent lack of conscious control. Most quirks have some kind of mental trigger, something the user can consciously activate or deactivate." "I tried to turn it off," Izuku said quietly. "I just didn't know how. We'll work on it. In the meantime, I'm recommending you for additional training with specialized support equipment. Quirks like yours, ones with potentially dangerous side effects, require extra precautions." Potentially dangerous. The words hit harder than they should have, carrying with them the weight of every fearful look he'd gotten from his classmates. "Am I going to be expelled?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. "Not for having a difficult quirk," Aizawa said firmly, "but you will be expelled if you can't learn to control it safely. UA has a responsibility to protect all its students, not just the ones with flashy powers." Izuku nodded, throat tight. "I understand. Good, now get changed and head to your next class. And Midoriya," Aizawa's voice stopped him at the door. "Whatever you're not telling me about those dreams, figure it out quickly. Quirks don't manifest in a vacuum. There's always a reason." The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductory lectures and nervous glances. Izuku's classmates weren't openly hostile, but there was a definite space around his desk that hadn't been there that morning. Even the more outgoing students seemed to hesitate before approaching him. Only Uraraka made an effort to include him in conversations, and even she seemed more careful than before. Like she was talking to someone who might accidentally hurt her if she said the wrong thing, which Izuku realized with a sick feeling might actually be true. Lunch was a quiet affair. He sat alone at a table near the window, picking at his food while watching other students laugh and bond over shared interests. At the next table over, a group was comparing quirks, showing off small, controlled demonstrations. A girl with earphone jacks for earlobes made her heartbeat audible through the speakers. A boy with multiple arms juggled 5 pieces of fruit simultaneously. Nothing dangerous, nothing that made people back away in fear. Nothing like the field of decay he'd created without meaning to. Mind if I sit? Izuku looked up to find Ida standing beside his table with a lunch tray, his expression politely neutral. You don't have to, Izuku said quickly. I know my quirk is concerning. All quirks have the potential to be concerning in the wrong hands, Ida replied, settling into the seat across from him. The question is what kind of hands they're in. It was a surprisingly mature perspective from someone who was probably his own age. Izuku felt some of the tension in his shoulders relax. Thanks, I guess I'm still getting used to. Having a quirk at all, late manifestation, something like that. Izuku poked at his rice, trying to figure out how to explain something he didn't understand himself. It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the organized chaos of a cafeteria full of future heroes. Izuku was starting to think he might actually make it through lunch without incident when he felt it again, that strange, heavy sensation in the air around him. His chopsticks were aging in his hand, the wood becoming brittle and gray. Ida, he said quietly, you should probably move. Ida looked down at the table, where the plastic surface was starting to show stress fractures, then back at Izuku's face with calm understanding. Deep breaths, he said, not moving from his seat. Whatever is triggering this, you can work through it. But Izuku wasn't sure that was true. The field was expanding again, maybe a meter radius this time, and other students were starting to notice. A few got up and moved to different tables, their expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. I can't stop it, Izuku whispered. I don't know how. Then don't try to stop it, Ida said firmly. Try to understand it instead. What does it feel like when it activates? Izuku closed his eyes and tried to focus on the sensation rather than fight it. The field felt patient, ancient, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. And underneath it all, that same whispered word, respira. The breath of time itself, said the voice that wasn't quite his own. The authority to decide what endures and what crumbles to dust. Authority, Izuku murmured without meaning to. What about authority? Ida asked. Izuku opened his eyes and the field was gone. The cafeteria was back to normal speed, his chopsticks were plain wood and the table was unmarked plastic. I think my quirk has something to do with authority. Control over, time, decay, I'm not sure. Ida nodded thoughtfully. That would explain the field effect. If your quirk grants you some form of temporal authority, it might manifest as an area of influence rather than a targeted effect. It was a reasonable theory and probably close to the truth. But it didn't explain the dreams, or the voice that spoke with knowledge Izuku had never learned, or the growing certainty that there was something important he was supposed to remember. The lunch bell rang, signaling the end of their break. As they walked back to class, Ida offered one final piece of advice. Whatever you're dealing with, don't try to handle it alone. UA has resources and your classmates want to help. But only if you let them. Izuku nodded, but privately he wondered if that was true. How could he ask for help with something he didn't understand himself? How could he explain dreams of bone thrones and crowns of shadow? How could he tell them that sometimes, when the field activated, he felt like someone else entirely? Someone older, more powerful, and infinitely more dangerous. As they reached the classroom, Izuku caught sight of Aizawa waiting by the door with his phone pressed to his ear. Want a consultation as soon as possible, the teacher was saying. Yes, I know it's unusual. No, it can't wait until next week. He ended the call and looked directly at Izuku with an expression that was equal parts concern and professional interest. Midoriya, my office after classes end. We need to talk. The rest of the afternoon dragged by with all the enthusiasm of a funeral procession. Izuku tried to pay attention to hero law and basic combat theory, but his mind kept drifting to the conversation waiting for him at the end of the day. When the final bell rang, his classmates filed out with the usual mix of relief and excitement for whatever plans they had for the evening. Izuku gathered his things slowly, putting off the inevitable. Good luck, Uraraka said softly as she passed his desk. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it'll work out. He hoped she was right. Aizawa's office was small and cluttered, dominated by a desk covered in student files and coffee-stained paperwork. The teacher gestured for Izuku to sit in the single chair across from him. I've been making some calls, Aizawa began without preamble, checking databases, consulting with specialists, trying to find any record of a quirk similar to yours. And nothing. Which is unusual. Aizawa leaned back in his chair, studying Izuku with those sharp black eyes. Quirks don't appear out of nowhere, especially not ones with this level of complexity. There's always a genetic component, a family history, some kind of precedent. Izuku's throat felt dry. What are you saying? I'm saying that either you're the first documented case of a completely novel quirk type, or there's something about your situation that doesn't add up. Aizawa paused, then added quietly, tell me about the dreams, Midoriya. The question hit like a physical blow. How did you mentioned them earlier, then tried to change the subject. In my experience, the things people don't want to talk about are usually the most important. Aizawa's expression was patient but implacable. I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with. Izuku stared at his hands, trying to figure out how to explain something that sounded insane even to him. I dream about a throne room, he said finally. Stone walls, high ceilings, shadows everywhere, and there's this throne made of bones and I'm sitting on it with a crown on my head, like I'm some kind of king. Aizawa made a note. How long have you been having these dreams? Since the entrance exam, every night. Izuku looked up, meeting his teacher's eyes. And in the dreams I know things, about authority, about time, about, he swallowed hard. About power over life and death. Do you recognize the place, the throne room? No, but it feels familiar, like coming home after a long trip. The words felt strange in his mouth, but they were true. And sometimes when my quirk activates, I hear this voice. Not mine, but older, like someone who's used to being obeyed. Aizawa was quiet for a long moment, tapping his pen against his desk while he processed the information. I want you to see someone, he said finally. A specialist who deals with unusual quirk manifestations and psychological phenomena. Dr. Yamada has experience with cases that don't fit standard categories. Am I going crazy? The question slipped out before Izuku could stop it. I don't think so, but I think there's more to your situation than a simple late manifesting quirk. Aizawa stood, moving to the window that overlooked the training grounds. In the meantime, I'm assigning you to remedial training with additional safety protocols. You'll work with support specialists to develop control techniques and protective equipment. And if I can't learn to control it, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Aizawa turned back to face him, his expression serious but not unkind. UA doesn't give up on students easily, Midoriya, but you have to be honest with us and with yourself about what we're dealing with. Izuku nodded, throat tight with gratitude and fear in equal measure. I'll try. Good. Now go home, get some rest, and try not to age anything on the way out. The train ride back to his apartment was quieter than usual, his mind churning with everything that had happened. His reflection in the window looked the same as always, messy green hair, two big eyes, the face of someone who'd never quite grown into himself. But behind those familiar eyes, something ancient and patient was stirring. Waiting. And for the first time since this all began, Izuku wasn't sure which voice in his head was really his own. The specialized training ground was empty except for All Might and a collection of monitoring equipment that looked like it belonged in a research lab rather than a school. Izuku stood in the center of it all, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Relax, young Midoriya, All Might said, though his usual booming confidence was tempered with something that might have been concern. We're simply going to run a few tests to better understand your abilities. 3 days had passed since the cafeteria incident. 3 days of carefully controlled interactions with his classmates, of sitting alone during lunch, of pretending not to notice the way conversations stopped when he walked into a room. The specialized equipment Aizawa had mentioned turned out to be support gear designed to monitor and contain dangerous quirks. Thick gloves that supposedly prevented accidental activation. Sensors that would alert faculty if his power spiked unexpectedly. It felt like wearing a muzzle. What kind of tests? Izuku asked, pulling at the monitoring devices attached to his arms and chest. Nothing invasive, just some controlled applications so we can measure output, range, and duration. All Might gestured to a series of metal plates arranged at various distances. Start with the closest target. Try to activate your quirk deliberately this time. Izuku approached the nearest plate, a square of steel about the size of a textbook. He'd been practicing control exercises for the past few days with limited success. Sometimes nothing happened at all. Sometimes the effect was so subtle he wondered if he'd imagined it. And sometimes the air around him turned thick and heavy, and time itself seemed to slow. He placed his palm against the metal and tried to find that feeling from the entrance exam. The sense of natural authority, of power that belonged to him as surely as his own heartbeat. Nothing. Having trouble? All Might asked after a minute of Izuku staring intently at unmarked steel. It's not consistent. Sometimes it just happens, and sometimes I can't make it work at all. Frustration leaked into his voice despite his best efforts. I don't understand the trigger. emotion perhaps. Many quirks respond to the user's mental state. Izuku tried again, this time thinking about the cafeteria incident, about the fear in his classmates' eyes. The familiar knot of anxiety formed in his chest, the steel began to rust. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady persistence of years compressed into seconds. Brown stains spread across the surface like spilled coffee, and the edges started to flake away. Fascinating, All Might murmured, checking his instruments. Energy readings are unusual, not quite like anything in our databases. The decay effect spread beyond the plate now, touching the concrete floor beneath it. Izuku jerked his hand back, but the aging continued for several more seconds before finally stopping. I can't control it once it starts, he said quietly. It has its own momentum. All Might made notes on his tablet, his expression thoughtful. Let's try something different. Instead of trying to stop the effect, try directing it. See if you can limit it to just the target plate. They spent the next hour working through variations, different materials, different emotional states, different levels of focus. The results were inconsistent but telling. Organic materials aged more slowly than metal or stone. The effect seemed to respond to his emotional state, but not in predictable ways. Fear made it spread uncontrollably. Anger made it more intense, but calm focus. Calm focus made it feel like something else entirely. All right, All Might said after Izuku had successfully aged a wooden block without affecting the table it sat on. I think that's enough for today. But before you go, I want to try one more thing. He led Izuku to a different section of the training ground, where a single chair sat in the center of a circle marked on the floor. I want you to sit here and try to activate your quirk without touching anything. Just let it happen naturally. Are you sure that's safe? All Might's smile was reassuring but serious. The monitoring equipment will alert us if anything goes beyond acceptable parameters, and I'm here to intervene if necessary. Izuku settled into the chair and closed his eyes. Instead of trying to force the effect, he let his mind drift. The training ground was quiet except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of other classes practicing their techniques. Gradually, he became aware of a strange sensation, like sinking into warm water or settling into a chair that fit perfectly. The feeling of coming home. Home. The word carried weight he didn't understand. Images flickered behind his closed eyelids, not the apartment where he lived with his mother, but somewhere else. Somewhere vast and empty and achingly familiar. Stone walls rising into shadow, a ceiling lost in darkness. And in the center of it all, a throne carved from what looked like bleached bone, sitting on a dais that commanded a view of everything. His kingdom, his domain, his right to rule over. Izuku's eyes snapped open and the training ground was wrong. The air shimmered with heat distortion, and everything within a 5-meter radius was aging at visible speed. The concrete floor developed cracks and wear patterns. Metal fixtures showed rust and corrosion. Even the air itself felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through water. Interesting, said a voice that wasn't All Might's. Izuku turned to see a figure in elaborate robes standing where the hero had been moments before. The man was tall and thin, with a mustache that would have looked ridiculous on anyone else but somehow conveyed dignity and authority. His hands were gloved, and geometric patterns floated in the air around him like solid light. Taisai Hachai, the man said with a slight bow, captain of the Kido Corps, Soul Society, and you, young king, are someone I thought I would never see again. The words hit Izuku like a physical blow. Recognition flooded through him, not his own memory, but something older, deeper. This man had been his enemy once, had trapped him, defeated him, sent him to his death with binding spells and clever tactics. But that was impossible. This was just a training exercise with All Might. He was Midoriya Izuku, 15 years old, student at UA High School. He'd never seen this man before in his life. So why did he know exactly how those geometric patterns worked? Why could he feel the spiritual pressure radiating from Hachai's form like heat from a forge? I don't know what you're talking about, Izuku said, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Deeper, more resonant. Don't you? Hachai stepped closer, seemingly unaffected by the temporal distortion field. Baraggan Louis Sainbairn, former king of Hueco Mundo, the aspect of death representing aging, ruler of Las Notches until Aizen's arrival. Each word struck like a hammer blow against something fragile in Izuku's mind. Memories, not his memories, but memories nonetheless, began to surface. A crown of bone, a scepter of authority, the absolute certainty that time itself bent to his will. I am the king of Hueco Mundo, he heard himself say in that deeper voice. Time is under my dominion. All things grow old and die under the weight of my years. That is my power, senescentia. But those weren't his words, weren't his memories, were they? This isn't real, Izuku whispered, pressing his hands against his temples. This is some kind of hallucination. Quirks don't work like this. People don't just remember being someone else. Reality is more complex than your current worldview allows, Hachi said gently. Souls carry imprints across lifetimes. Memories, powers, fundamental aspects of identity, these things don't simply disappear when the body dies. The training ground around them began to fade, replaced by something else. A vast desert under a crescent moon, ancient ruins stretching to the horizon, and rising above it all, a palace of white stone that gleamed like bone in the moonlight. Las Notches, his fortress, his seat of power. No, Izuku said firmly, fighting against the tide of foreign memories. I'm not him. I'm not a king or a ruler or whatever this is supposed to be. I'm just a kid who wants to be a hero. And yet you carry his power, his memories. His very soul, reborn into a new form. Hachi's expression was sad but not unsympathetic. The question is not whether you are Baraggan Louis Sainbairn, you are, whether you accept it or not. The question is what kind of person you choose to be with that knowledge. The desert scene wavered, and Izuku caught glimpses of the training ground beneath it like a double-exposed photograph. Reality was reasserting itself, but the memories remained. Centuries of existence. The gradual understanding that his power over aging made him effectively immortal, the crushing loneliness of outliving everything and everyone. The desperate need to prove his supremacy over death itself. And finally, the battle with this same man, the humiliation of defeat. The binding spell that turned his own power against him until even his immortal form crumbled to dust. But also, the moment of recognition in his final seconds. The understanding that his pride, his need to dominate, had led to his downfall. The wish, barely formed before death claimed him, that he might have used his power differently. To protect rather than rule, to preserve rather than destroy. I remember, Izuku said quietly, the temporal field around him stabilized, no longer chaotic but controlled, purposeful. I remember. Dying, and now you live again, Hachi said, with a chance to make different choices. The desert faded completely, leaving them back in the training ground, but Hachi was fading too, becoming translucent around the edges. This was never real, was it? Izuku asked. You're not actually here. I am a memory made manifest by your awakening power, a reflection of your soul recognizing itself. Hachi's form was barely visible now, more suggestion than substance. But my words are true. You have been given a rare gift, the chance to redeem a life poorly lived. How? How can I use this power for good when it's fundamentally destructive? All power can destroy, young king. What matters is the will that guides it. Your predecessor sought to prove his supremacy over death. Perhaps you might choose instead to serve life. Hachi disappeared entirely, leaving Izuku alone in the training ground with the weight of 2 lifetimes pressing against his consciousness. The monitoring equipment was beeping frantically, and he could hear footsteps running in his direction. But for just a moment, he sat in perfect stillness and understood who he really was. Midoriya Izuku, who dreamed of being a hero. Baraggan Louis Sainbairn, who had learned too late that true strength came from protecting others. 2 souls, 2 sets of memories, 1 body, 1 choice. All Might burst through the doors just as the temporal field collapsed completely. His hero instincts undoubtedly triggered by whatever readings the monitors had been producing. He skidded to a stop when he saw Izuku sitting calmly in the chair, apparently unharmed. Young Midoriya, are you all right? The sensors were going crazy, energy readings unlike anything we've ever recorded. Izuku looked up at him, and All Might took an involuntary step back. There was something different in the boy's eyes now, older, heavier. I'm fine, Izuku said, standing slowly, but I think I understand my quirk better now. What happened? You were unconscious for nearly 10 minutes and the temporal distortion field was. All Might paused, studying Izuku's face more carefully. You look different. What did you remember? Everything, Izuku said simply. I remembered everything. They were interrupted by an alarm klaxon echoing across the campus. All Might's phone buzzed immediately and he answered it with practiced efficiency. What? Where? How many? His expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. All right, I'm on my way. No, keep the other students back. This is not a training exercise. He ended the call and looked at Izuku with something between concern and calculation. There's a villain attack in progress about 6 blocks from here. Building collapse, multiple civilians trapped. He paused, then asked quietly, how much control do you have now? Izuku considered the question seriously. The memories of Baraggan's centuries of experience with Senescentia were clear in his mind, along with techniques and applications he'd never imagined. But more importantly, he understood the fundamental nature of his power now, not just decay, but authority over time itself. "Enough," he said, "I can help." All Might studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close to me, follow my lead, and if I tell you to retreat, you retreat immediately." "Understood, understood." They ran through the halls of UA, past confused students and faculty who were just beginning to respond to the alarm. All Might moved with the fluid efficiency of years of hero work, but Izuku found he could keep up more easily than he expected. His body felt different now, not stronger exactly, but more substantial, like he took up more space in the world than his physical form suggested. The scene outside was chaos. A mid-rise office building had partially collapsed, its facade sheared away to reveal floors of trapped workers. Other heroes were already on scene, Kamui Woods extending his branches to support weakened structures, MT. Lady carefully lifting debris from the street level, but there was a problem. "Gas leak," one of the rescue workers shouted. "The whole building's filled with it, one spark and the whole thing goes up," All Might cursed under his breath. "Can't use most quirks in there, too risky." Izuku stepped forward, studying the building with eyes that now carried centuries of tactical experience. The structure was unstable but salvageable. The gas would dissipate naturally, but not before people suffocated or the building finished collapsing. Unless someone could slow down time inside the building. Give the gas time to settle, the structure time to stabilize, the rescue workers time to evacuate people without rushing. "I can do this," he said quietly. All Might looked at him sharply. "Midoriya, this isn't a training exercise. If you lose control, I won't." Izuku's voice carried absolute certainty. "This is what my power is for." He walked toward the building, ignoring the shouts of confusion from other heroes. At the edge of the debris field, he stopped and placed both hands on a fallen chunk of concrete. The temporal field spread outward from his touch like ripples in still water. But this time, instead of chaotic aging, it was controlled, precise. The gas inside the building slowed its dispersal, hanging in the air like fog. Falling debris drifted downward at a fraction of its normal speed. Even the building's structural collapse seemed to pause, giving everyone time to think and plan. Inside the field, rescue workers found they could move normally while everything else proceeded at a crawl. They evacuated trapped civilians with methodical efficiency, no longer racing against time because time itself was waiting for them. Izuku held the field steady for 27 minutes. Long enough for everyone to be brought to safety. Long enough for the gas to settle and dissipate. Long enough for Kamui Woods to shore up the remaining structure and MT, Lady to clear the street. When he finally let the field collapse, the building settled into its new configuration with hardly a whisper of additional damage. The immediate crisis was over. All Might was beside him instantly, catching his arm as Izuku swayed on his feet. "Easy there, that was extraordinary work." "Thank you." Izuku straightened, surprised to find that while he was tired, he wasn't exhausted. Baraggan's memories included techniques for managing the energy cost of extended Senescentia use. "Are the civilians all right?" "All accounted for, minor injuries only." All Might's expression was proud but worried. "That was professional-level rescue work, young Midoriya. But I have to ask, how did you know you could do that?" Izuku looked at the building, at the people being treated by paramedics, at the other heroes who were looking at him with new respect rather than fear. "I remembered what my power is really for," he said. "Not to destroy things, but to preserve them, to give people time when they need it most." It was true as far as it went. He couldn't tell All Might about Baraggan, about the memories of an ancient king learning too late that true authority came from serving others. That was his burden to carry. But he could show them what those memories had taught him. "Come on," All Might said, guiding him toward the street where a car was waiting. "We need to get you checked out by Recovery Girl, and then we have a lot to discuss." As they drove back to UA, Izuku caught sight of his reflection in the window. The same green hair, the same freckled face, the same two big eyes. But behind them, ancient wisdom waited patiently. He had been given a second chance, a chance to use immense power in service of life rather than in pursuit of dominance. The memories of Baraggan's failures would guide him, but they wouldn't define him. Midoriya Izuku would choose his own path. And that path led toward becoming the kind of hero who gave people time when they needed it most. Even if it meant carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes to do it. The woman waiting in training ground beta looked like she'd stepped out of a steampunk novel. Dr. Temporal, her hero name, apparently wore a modified costume that blended Victorian elegance with modern tactical gear. Her jacket was deep blue leather reinforced with what looked like carbon fiber, and an intricate pocket watch hung from a chain across her chest. Most striking were her gloves, which seemed to shimmer with their own internal light, and the brass goggles pushed up onto her silver-streaked hair. "You must be Midoriya," she said, extending a gloved hand. Her voice carried a slight accent that Izuku couldn't place. "I'm Dr. Akira Temporal. I specialize in time-related quirks and their applications." Izuku shook her hand carefully, still paranoid about accidental activation. "Thank you for agreeing to help me. I know this is unusual. Unusual is my specialty." Her smile was warm but professional. "I've reviewed All Might's reports and the sensor data from your recent incident. Your power is definitely time-based, but the mechanism is unlike anything I've encountered." She led him to a series of tables set up with various materials: metal plates, wooden blocks, plastic samples, even some potted plants. Each table had monitoring equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a training ground. "Most time quirks work by accelerating or decelerating the user," Dr. Temporal explained, pulling on a second pair of gloves over her first. "I can slow my personal timeline to make myself faster relative to everything else. There's a hero in Osaka who can skip forward in time by a few seconds, but you're actually manipulating temporal flow in a defined area. Is that bad? It's unprecedented, which makes it both fascinating and potentially dangerous." She gestured to the nearest table. "Shall we begin with some basic control exercises?" The next 2 hours were the most productive training Izuku had ever experienced. Dr. Temporal's approach was methodical and scientific. Instead of just telling him to try harder or focus more, she had him experiment with different emotional states while monitoring the energy output. They mapped the correlation between his stress levels and field radius, between his emotional state and the intensity of the aging effect. "Anger makes it more intense but less controlled," she noted, making observations on her tablet as Izuku deliberately aged a steel plate while thinking about every time Bakugo had called him useless. "Fear makes it spread rapidly but weakens the effect per square meter. What about contentment?" That was harder. Izuku had spent so many years afraid or frustrated that finding genuine contentment felt like reaching for something on a high shelf. But when he managed it, thinking about his mother's proud smile when he'd told her about getting into UA, the effect became precise, controlled, almost surgical. "Interesting," Dr. Temporal murmured. "Positive emotions seem to give you finer control. We'll build on that." They moved on to material differentiation. The wooden block aged visibly under his touch, but much more slowly than the metal plates. The plastic samples showed stress fractures but didn't crumble. And the plants— "I can't do it," Izuku said, staring at the potted flower he'd been asked to age. He'd been touching the stem for nearly a minute, but nothing was happening. "It won't work on living things." "Won't or can't?" Dr. Temporal asked, checking her instruments. "The energy readings show your power is active, but it's being resisted somehow." Izuku closed his eyes and reached for Baraggan's memories, looking for understanding. What he found surprised him. Living things had spiritual energy, what Soul Society called Reiatsu. That energy created a natural resistance to senescentia, though it could be overcome with enough force or sustained application. But more than that, Baraggan had learned over the centuries that aging living beings was unsatisfying, empty. It proved nothing except that he was willing to destroy something irreplaceable. "It's not that I can't," Izuku said slowly. "It's that I don't want to. Living things resist the effect naturally, and forcing it feels wrong." Dr. Temporal made another note. "Moral limitations can actually strengthen quirk control. If your power responds to your intentions, having clear ethical boundaries will make it more predictable." They spent another hour working on field control, creating the temporal distortion without touching anything, varying the size and intensity, learning to maintain it while moving around. It was exhausting work, but Izuku could feel himself improving with each attempt. "That's enough for today," Dr. Temporal said finally. "But before you go, I want you to try something." She led him to a corner of the training ground where several mannequins were set up at different distances, each equipped with various sensors and monitoring devices. "I want you to create a defensive field," she said. "Imagine you're protecting those mannequins from some kind of attack. Don't try to age them, try to slow down anything that might hurt them." Izuku positioned himself between the mannequins and took a deep breath. Instead of focusing on decay or destruction, he thought about the building collapse from yesterday, about giving people time when they needed it most. The field that formed was different from anything he'd created before. Instead of the oppressive weight of accelerated aging, this felt protective, stabilizing, like time itself was being careful. "Remarkable," Dr. Temporal said, studying her readings. "You're creating a temporal buffer zone. Anything entering that field would be significantly slowed while everything inside maintains normal flow. That's advanced technique. Most time manipulators take years to develop that level of precision." "It feels natural," Izuku admitted. "Like something I've done before." Muscle memory can persist even with late manifesting quirks. Your body might remember techniques your conscious mind never learned. She began packing up her equipment. "We'll meet 3 times a week. I'll also be working with the support department to develop some specialized gear for you." "What kind of gear?" "Field limiters, first and foremost. Devices that can automatically contain your power if it starts to spread beyond safe parameters." She showed him a prototype that looked like a cross between a fitness tracker and a medical alert bracelet. "This will monitor your stress levels and field output. If either spikes beyond preset limits, it'll activate a localized counterfield to neutralize the effect." Izuku strapped on the device, surprised by how light it was. "And this will work even if I lose control." "That's the idea. We'll also be developing specialized gloves and costume materials that resist temporal effects, so you can interact normally with people and objects when you want to." The possibilities were intriguing. For the first time since discovering his quirk, Izuku felt like he might actually be able to have a normal life alongside his abilities. "Dr. Temporal," he said as they walked back toward the main building, "why are you helping me?" "I mean, I appreciate it, but this must be way outside your normal consulting work." She paused, considering her answer. 20 years ago, I had a student with a time acceleration quirk. Brilliant kid, incredible potential, but he couldn't control the emotional triggers. One day, he got scared during a villain attack and accidentally aged himself 30 years in 30 seconds. Izuku felt his stomach drop. What happened to him? He lived, but his hero career was over before it started. I've regretted not pushing harder for better safety protocols ever since. Her expression was sad but determined. I won't let that happen to another student, not if I can prevent it. They were almost back to the main building when a familiar explosion echoed across the training grounds. "Deku," Bakugo's voice carried clearly across the distance, followed by the rapid-fire pops of his quirk being used at high intensity. Izuku winced. That particular tone usually meant Bakugo was working through something complicated and had decided that explosions were the solution. "Friend of yours?" Dr. Temporal asked, amused. "Childhood friend, it's complicated," Izuku sighed. "I should probably go see what he wants." "Actually, that might be perfect timing. I was going to recommend you practice with a sparring partner, someone who can push you to use your abilities under pressure without being afraid of hurting you." Izuku looked at her like she'd suggested juggling live grenades. "You want me to spar with Bakugo? He's intense." Intense is good for control training. The more stress you can handle while maintaining precision, the more reliable your power becomes in real situations. She had a point, but Izuku still felt like he was walking toward his own execution as they headed for the source of the explosions. They found Bakugo in training ground gamma, systematically destroying practice targets with increasingly elaborate explosion combinations. His movements were fluid and precise, but there was an edge of frustration in the way he was pushing himself. "Kachan," Izuku called out. "Everything okay?" Bakugo spun around, his red eyes immediately locking onto Dr. Temporal with suspicious interest. "Who's this?" "Dr. Temporal. She's helping me train my quirk." "About time." Bakugo stalked closer, his hands still smoking from residual explosions. "You've been walking around like a live grenade for 2 weeks. People are starting to think you can't control it at all." The comment stung because it was partially true. Despite yesterday's success with the building collapse, Izuku still felt like his power had a mind of its own most of the time. "I'm working on it," he said defensively. "Working on it isn't good enough." Bakugo's voice carried the edge it got when he was about to issue a challenge. "If you're going to be in my class, you need to prove you're not going to accidentally age someone to death during training." Dr. Temporal stepped forward before Izuku could respond. "Actually, Mr. Bakugo, you raise an excellent point. Midoriya needs to practice using his abilities under combat stress. Would you be interested in helping with that training?" Bakugo's expression shifted from irritated to intrigued. "You want me to fight him? I want you to challenge him in a controlled environment. Push him to use his power defensively while you attack with yours." She gestured to the training ground around them. "Nothing that would cause permanent damage, but enough pressure to test his control." And if he loses control and ages me into dust? That's what these are for, she said, producing 2 more of the prototype limiters. Automatic shutoff if the temporal field exceeds safe parameters. Bakugo looked at the device with the expression of someone being asked to wear a leash, then at Izuku with calculation in his red eyes. Fine, he said finally, strapping on the limiter, but I'm not going easy on you just because you've got some fancy new power. I wouldn't want you to, Izuku replied, though his heart was already beating faster. Dr. Temporal moved to a safe distance and pulled out her monitoring equipment. Standard sparring rules. First to land 3 solid hits wins. Quirks allowed, but nothing that would require Recovery Girl's intervention. Ready? Izuku settled into a defensive stance, trying to calm his nerves and find the centered feeling that seemed to help with control. Across from him, Bakugo cracked his knuckles, small explosions popping between his fingers. Don't hold back, Deku, Bakugo said with a fierce grin. I want to see what all the fuss is about. Begin, Dr. Temporal called. Bakugo immediately launched himself forward with a controlled explosion, closing the distance faster than Izuku had expected. But instead of panicking, Izuku found himself analyzing the attack with a clarity that felt foreign. Too direct. Too committed to the initial vector. A simple sidestep would, the thoughts weren't entirely his own. Baraggan's centuries of combat experience were bleeding through, providing tactical insights that his 15-year-old brain had never learned. Izuku sidestepped just as the ancient king's memories suggested, then placed his palm on the ground. The temporal field spread outward in a controlled wave, slowing Bakugo's follow-up attack enough for Izuku to roll away safely. Interesting, Bakugo said, landing in a crouch. But defense won't win you this fight. He launched a series of rapid-fire explosions, forcing Izuku to dodge and weave while maintaining the defensive field. It was harder than expected, keeping the temporal effect stable while moving took concentration he was still developing. But with each exchange, Izuku felt more confident. The limiter on his wrist remained green, indicating his power was staying within safe parameters. And more importantly, he was starting to anticipate Bakugo's attacks not through luck or desperation, but through genuine tactical understanding. Aggressive fighters often telegraph their intentions through micro-movements, Baraggan's memories supplied. The slight shift in weight distribution before a major attack, the way the eyes focus on the intended target. You're fighting differently, Bakugo observed, circling for another approach. More tactical, like you actually know what you're doing. I'm learning, Izuku replied, which was true enough. Their sparring session continued for another 20 minutes, with Bakugo gradually increasing the intensity of his attacks and Izuku responding with increasingly sophisticated defensive maneuvers. By the end, both were breathing hard, but neither had managed to land 3 solid hits. Draw, Dr. Temporal called. Excellent work, both of you. Bakugo looked frustrated by the non-victory, but also oddly pleased. Not bad, Deku, you're actually starting to fight like you have a brain. Thanks, I think. Same time tomorrow, Bakugo asked, already heading toward the exit. I want to see how you handle real pressure. After he left, Dr. Temporal approached with her equipment, looking pleased with the session's data. That was remarkable, she said, showing Izuku the readouts. Your control remained stable even under significant stress, and your tactical responses showed marked improvement as the session progressed. It felt like I was remembering techniques I'd never learned, Izuku admitted. Is that normal for quirks that affect fundamental forces like time? Sometimes. She packed away her monitoring gear. The important thing is that you maintained ethical boundaries while accessing that knowledge. Your power never targeted Bakugo directly, even when it might have been tactically advantageous. That was true. Even with Baraggan's combat experience bleeding through, Izuku had never felt tempted to age his opponent directly. The idea felt fundamentally wrong, like trying to write with the wrong hand. How did I do overall? He asked. Better than I expected. You're developing conscious control faster than most time manipulators, and your instinctive limitations are actually helping rather than hindering your development. She smiled encouragingly. At this rate, you should be ready for regular class training within a few weeks. The words sent a warm feeling of accomplishment through Izuku's chest. For the first time since discovering his quirk, he felt like he might actually master it rather than being mastered by it. As they walked back to the main building, Dr. Temporal outlined the training schedule for the coming weeks. 3 sessions with her focusing on precision and control, daily sparring with Bakugo to build combat applications, and specialized support gear development to ensure safety during regular classwork. "One more thing," she said as they reached the faculty building. "I want you to keep a training journal. Document how your abilities feel, what triggers different effects, any unusual sensations or memories that surface during practice. Sometimes patterns only become clear when you see them written down." Izuku nodded, already mentally organizing the observations he'd made during today's session. The journal would also give him a place to work through the integration of Baraggan's memories without having to explain the full situation to anyone else. "Dr. Temporal," he said as she prepared to leave, "thank you. For the first time since this started, I feel like I might actually become the kind of hero I want to be." "You already are," she replied with quiet certainty. "The power doesn't make the hero, Midoriya, the choices do. And every choice you've made so far has been to protect people rather than dominate them." As she walked away, Izuku stood for a moment in the fading afternoon light, processing the day's training. His body ached pleasantly from the sparring session, and his mind felt clearer than it had since the entrance exam. He was still Midoriya Izuku, still the boy who dreamed of being a hero. But now he was also something more, someone with the power to give people time when they needed it most, guided by the hard-won wisdom of a king who had learned too late that true strength came from service rather than dominance. The path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like one he could actually walk. The news van was parked outside UA's gates when Izuku arrived for classes on Monday morning. He tried to slip past unnoticed, but the reporter, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a predatory smile, spotted him immediately. Midoriya Izuku." She thrust a microphone toward his face while a cameraman materialized beside her. "Can you comment on the similarities between your quirk and that of the League of Villains Shigaraki Tomura?" Izuku's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this moment since the building rescue had made local news. The footage of him creating a massive temporal field had been dramatic enough to catch media attention, and apparently someone had drawn exactly the connection he'd hoped to avoid. That's not really the same thing," he managed, trying to edge toward the school gates. "Both quirks involve rapid decay, both create fields of destruction, both pose significant risks to civilian safety," the reporter pressed, following him step for step. "How can the public trust that you won't follow the same path as Japan's most wanted villain?" "Because I'm not trying to hurt people," Izuku said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm trying to help them, but isn't that what every villain claims before? That's enough." Aizawa appeared beside them like a shadow, his capture weapon already partially deployed. His tired eyes fixed on the reporter with the kind of look that suggested she was about to have a very bad day. "This is school property, you're trespassing." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "Leave now or I'll have you arrested." The reporter opened her mouth to argue, but something in Aizawa's expression made her reconsider. She signaled the cameraman, who shouldered his equipment with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over," she said to Izuku. "The public has a right to know about the dangers in their midst." After they left, Aizawa turned to study Izuku's face with the clinical interest of someone diagnosing a problem. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I've been better." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit that was becoming more pronounced. "I knew this would happen eventually, but it still sucks when people assume the worst about you based on surface similarities." Aizawa's expression was understanding in the way that came from personal experience. "Come on, we have bigger problems to worry about today." The bigger problem turned out to be a comprehensive team exercise designed to test creative quirk applications in rescue scenarios. Class 1A had been divided into groups of 4, with each team assigned a different disaster simulation. Izuku found himself grouped with Uraraka, Ida, and Todoroki, a combination that should have been encouraging but felt more like standing in front of a firing squad. Uraraka had been polite but distant since the cafeteria incident. Todoroki was his usual reserved self, but there was a new wariness in how he looked at Izuku. And Ida, despite his reassurances about wanting to help, still tensed slightly whenever Izuku moved too quickly. "Your scenario," All Might announced, handing them a tablet with mission parameters, "is a chemical plant explosion. Toxic gas is spreading through the surrounding residential area. Multiple civilians are trapped in buildings that are too dangerous to enter due to structural damage and contamination." Perfect. A scenario that played directly into every fear people had about his quirk: toxic substances, enclosed spaces, and plenty of opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong if he lost control. "How are we supposed to rescue people from buildings we can't enter?" Uraraka asked, studying the mission briefing. "That's for you to figure out," All Might replied with his trademark grin. You have 30 minutes to plan, then we'll run the simulation. They gathered in a corner of the training ground to strategize. The mock chemical plant was already releasing harmless but visible toxic gas, probably just colored vapor, that was drifting toward a cluster of buildings filled with rescue mannequins. Standard approach would be to evacuate the surrounding area and wait for the gas to dissipate naturally, Ida said, ever practical. But that could take hours, and the people trapped inside don't have that long. I could make some of the buildings weightless, Uraraka offered. Maybe lift them to get people out safely. Structural integrity would be compromised, Todoroki pointed out. The buildings might collapse when you return them to normal weight. They brainstormed for several more minutes, but every conventional solution ran into the same problems. The contamination made direct rescue impossible, and any attempt to breach the buildings risked exposure or structural collapse. Finally, Izuku cleared his throat. What if we didn't try to get into the buildings? He asked quietly. What if we brought the buildings to us? The others looked at him with varying degrees of confusion. I mean, what if we aged the contamination? He continued, warming to the idea. Chemical compounds break down over time. If I could accelerate that process in a controlled area, the gas might become inert before it reaches the trapped civilians. Todoroki frowned thoughtfully. That's actually not a terrible idea, but can you control the effect precisely enough to target just the gas? Dr. Temporal thinks so, and if I create a temporal field around each building, I could slow down the structural collapse while the gas breaks down naturally inside. Izuku looked around at his teammates, trying to gauge their reactions. It's risky, but it might work. What if you lose control? Uraraka asked, and her voice was careful, concerned rather than accusatory. What if the field spreads too far or affects the people inside? It was a fair question, and one Izuku had been asking himself since discovering his abilities. But over the past week of training with Dr. Temporal, he'd started to understand something important about his power. I can't lose control when I'm trying to protect people, he said with quiet certainty. It doesn't work that way. The power responds to intent, and my intent is always to preserve life. Ida adjusted his glasses, considering, you're proposing a complex multi-field operation. Temporal acceleration to break down the contaminants, temporal deceleration to stabilize the structures, all while maintaining precise boundaries to avoid affecting the civilians. Yes, that's actually brilliant, Ida said with surprise. Unconventional, but it addresses all the primary challenges of the scenario. Uraraka studied Izuku's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If you're sure you can do it safely, I think it's our best option. The vote of confidence from his teammates felt better than any grade he'd ever received. The simulation itself was even more complex than the planning phase. Izuku positioned himself at the center of the affected area, close enough to all three contaminated buildings to create overlapping temporal fields. The physical sensation was like trying to conduct an orchestra while solving calculus problems, multiple streams of power that had to be maintained simultaneously while keeping track of dozens of variables. Around the buildings, he created fields of accelerated time. The colored vapor that represented toxic gas began to break down visibly, its bright yellow color fading to clear as molecular bonds aged beyond stability. It was working, but slowly. Structural integrity declining in Building 2, Todoroki reported from his monitoring position. Southwest corner is showing stress fractures. Izuku adjusted the field around that building, slowing time enough to give the weakened structure additional support while maintaining the decontamination effect in the surrounding air. The precision required was exhausting, but he could feel Baraggan's memories guiding his technique. Centuries of experience with temporal manipulation, providing insights his conscious mind couldn't have developed in weeks of training. Gas concentrations dropping to safe levels, Ida announced, checking his instruments. Estimate 2 more minutes for complete neutralization. Those 2 minutes felt like an hour. Maintaining multiple complex fields while adjusting for changing conditions pushed Izuku's abilities to their current limits. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he could feel the familiar ache that meant he was approaching the edge of his stamina. But he held on. When All Might finally called exercise complete, all 3 buildings remained structurally sound, the contamination had been neutralized without spreading to surrounding areas, and every simulated civilian had been successfully rescued. Outstanding work, All Might announced as the class gathered for debriefing. Team Midoriya achieved complete mission success with 0 casualties and minimal collateral damage. The creative application of temporal manipulation to solve a complex multivariable problem was impressive. The praise felt good, but what felt better was the way his classmates were looking at him. Not with fear or wariness, but with something closer to respect, even admiration. "That was amazing, Midoriya," Kirishima called out. "I've never seen anyone use a quirk like that before." "Very manly problem-solving," added his usual enthusiasm, turning something destructive into something protective. Other voices joined in congratulations, questions about technique, genuine interest rather than suspicious distance. For the first time since discovering his quirk, Izuku felt like he might actually belong at UA. But it was Uraraka's quiet that was incredible that meant the most. Her brown eyes were bright with something that looked like genuine admiration, and when she smiled at him, there was no trace of the fear that had been there just weeks before. The press conference was Nezu's idea. "Public perception is a crucial aspect of hero work," the principal explained during their meeting after classes. "The media has raised questions about your abilities, and the best way to address those concerns is through transparent demonstration." Izuku sat in the conference room feeling like he was about to face a firing squad. Representatives from 3 major news networks were setting up cameras and lighting equipment, while PR specialists from UA's administration team coached him on message points and safe answers. "Remember," said the PR coordinator, a woman with kind eyes and an extremely professional demeanor, "the goal is to show the positive applications of your quirk. Focus on rescue work, on how your abilities can be used to protect people." "What if they ask about Shigaraki?" Izuku asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping him awake at night. "We've prepared talking points for that. The key is to emphasize the differences rather than getting defensive about the similarities." The conference itself was smaller than Izuku had expected, maybe a dozen reporters in a room that could have held 50. But the cameras made everything feel larger, more significant. Each question would be broadcast to thousands of people who would judge him based on how he answered. "Midoriya," the first reporter began, "can you explain how your quirk differs from other decay-based abilities we've seen?" Izuku took a breath and tried to channel the confidence he'd felt during the team exercise. "The fundamental difference is in the purpose and application," he said, remembering the coaching session. "My ability isn't about destruction, it's about preservation. I use temporal manipulation to give people time when they need it most, whether that's slowing down a building collapse so rescue workers can evacuate civilians, or aging toxic chemicals so they become harmless. But the end result is still decay, isn't it?" Another reporter pressed. "Things breaking down, aging, being destroyed." This was the question he'd been dreading, but also the one he'd thought about most deeply. "Decay isn't destruction," Izuku said, and the words came from a place deeper than the coach talking points. "It's transformation. When I age away a toxic spill, I'm not destroying it, I'm helping it become something harmless. When I create a temporal field around a collapsing building, I'm not stopping time, I'm giving time the space it needs to let people reach safety." He paused, looking directly into the main camera. "My power is about serving life, not taking it. About preservation, not destruction. Every choice I make with this ability is guided by one question: how can I use this to help people?" The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but the tone had shifted. Instead of focusing on the potential dangers of his quirk, reporters began asking about applications, about his training, about his goals as a future hero. "What would you say to people who are afraid of your abilities?" came the final question. Izuku thought about Uraraka's initial fear, about his classmates backing away in the cafeteria, about the wariness in people's eyes when they learned what his quirk could do. "I'd say that fear is understandable," he answered honestly. "Any power can be dangerous if it's used carelessly or with bad intentions. But I want people to judge me by my actions, not by their assumptions about my abilities. I'm training every day to use this quirk safely and effectively, and I'm surrounded by teachers and classmates who help me stay focused on what's really important: protecting people." After the press conference ended and the cameras were packed away, Izuku felt drained but oddly hopeful. He'd managed to get through it without any major mistakes, and the questions toward the end had actually seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile. "You did well," Nezu told him as they walked back toward the main building. "Honest, thoughtful, focused on service rather than power. That's exactly the message we wanted to convey. Do you think it will help?" "With some people, yes. Others will need more convincing. They'll want to see your actions over time, not just hear your words. But it's a good start." The real test came 3 days later. Izuku was walking home from his training session with Dr. Temporal when he heard the explosion. Not the controlled pops of Bakugo's quirk or the scheduled demolition work that sometimes echoed across the city, but the sharp, violent sound of something going very wrong. He ran toward the noise without thinking, his hero instincts overriding the part of his brain that pointed out he was still just a student. 3 blocks from UA, he found the source. A construction accident had ruptured a gas line, creating a growing cloud of toxic fumes that was drifting toward a nearby elementary school. Pro heroes were already on scene, but they were struggling with the same problem his team had faced during the simulation. The gas was too dangerous to approach directly, and the wind was carrying it toward a building full of children who couldn't be evacuated quickly enough. "I can help," Izuku said, approaching the hero, coordinating the response, a woman he recognized as Pixie Bob from the Wild Wild Pussycats. "Kid, this isn't a training exercise," she replied sharply. "Get back to the safety perimeter. I'm Midoriya from UA. My quirk can neutralize the gas by aging it past its toxic phase." Pixie Bob looked at him skeptically, but another hero, one Izuku didn't recognize, stepped forward. "I saw your press conference," the man said. "You're the Temporal kid. Can you really break down chemical compounds?" "Yes, but I need to get closer to create an effective field." The heroes exchanged glances, clearly weighing the risks. The gas cloud was maybe 2 minutes from reaching the school, and conventional approaches weren't working fast enough. "Do it," Pixie Bob decided, "but if you lose control, we're pulling you out immediately." Izuku nodded and ran toward the edge of the gas cloud, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. This wasn't a simulation or a training exercise. Real people, children, were counting on him to get this right. He placed both hands on the ground and let the temporal field expand outward, targeting the molecular structure of the toxic gas itself. Under the influence of accelerated time, complex hydrocarbons began breaking down into simpler, harmless compounds. The visible cloud started to thin and disperse, its dangerous components aging into inert gases that posed no threat to human health. It took 6 minutes to completely neutralize the contamination. 6 minutes of maintaining precise control over a complex field while surrounded by emergency responders and news cameras that had arrived to cover the incident. When it was over, when the air quality sensors showed safe levels and the evacuation order was lifted, Izuku collapsed to his knees from exhaustion. But through his fatigue, he could hear something that made it all worthwhile. Applause. Not just from the pro heroes and emergency workers, but from the crowd of civilians who had gathered to watch. People who had seen the news reports about his dangerous quirk were clapping for him, thanking him, treating him like the hero he was trying to become. "Nice work, kid," Pixie Bob said, offering him a hand up. That was some impressive control under pressure. As news crews interviewed witnesses and emergency responders praised the quick resolution of a potentially catastrophic incident, Izuku felt something settle into place in his chest. A sense of rightness, of purpose, of belonging. He was still Midoriya Izuku, still the boy who dreamed of being a hero. But now he was also something more, someone who could give people time when they needed it most, someone whose power served life instead of taking it. The path forward was still challenging, but for the first time since discovering his quirk, Izuku felt certain he was walking in the right direction. That night, the news coverage focused not on the similarities between his abilities and those of villains, but on the creative heroism he'd shown in neutralizing a serious threat. The narrative was shifting, slowly but surely. And in a small apartment across the city, his mother cried happy tears while watching her son being praised as a hero on the evening news. The first sign something was wrong was the birds. Izuku noticed them during his morning run, crows and pigeons and even a few hawks, all flying in the same direction with the desperate urgency of animals fleeing a forest fire. They weren't just migrating. They were escaping something. He might have dismissed it as coincidence if not for the dreams that had been getting more vivid lately. Not the usual memories of Baraggan's throne room, but something else. Darker. A sense of wrongness spreading like infection, of boundaries being violated by things that shouldn't exist. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert just as he reached UA's gates. Villain incident, downtown area. All Hero Course students report to emergency assembly. The message was brief. But the fact that it included first-year students meant this wasn't a routine villain attack. Izuku picked up his pace, dread settling in his stomach like a stone. The emergency assembly hall buzzed with nervous energy as Class 1A filed in alongside the older students. Principal Nezu stood at the front with several pro heroes Izuku didn't recognize, their expressions grim in a way that suggested this briefing wasn't going to be routine. "Attention, students," Nezu began, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by professional gravity. "We have a developing situation in the downtown commercial district. Multiple entities of unknown origin have appeared and are proving resistant to conventional hero tactics. The main screen lit up with shaky footage from news helicopters. Izuku's blood went cold as he watched. The things on the screen weren't quite human. They moved like people, wore the remnants of clothing, but something was fundamentally wrong with them. Their forms seemed to flicker and distort, as if reality couldn't quite decide what they were supposed to be. Worse, everything around them was degrading, not aging like when Izuku used his quirk, but actually dissolving at the molecular level. "We're calling them erosion entities for now," Nezu continued. "They appear to emit some form of field that breaks down both organic and inorganic matter. Standard physical attacks pass through them without effect. Energy-based quirks are absorbed or reflected. Several pro-heroes have been affected." The footage switched to show heroes Izuku recognized, Kamui Woods MT, Lady, even some from the top 10, retreating from the entities with visible injuries. Not cuts or burns, but something worse. Parts of their bodies looked faded, as if someone had started erasing them. "Holy shit," Bakugo whispered, which was alarming because Bakugo never whispered. "The affected area is expanding," Nezu said, and Izuku caught the edge of genuine worry in the principal's voice. "Current estimates suggest if this continues unchecked, it will reach residential areas within 2 hours." Aizawa stepped forward, his capture weapon already deployed and his expression darker than usual. "First through third years will maintain evacuation perimeters, no direct engagement with the entities." His eyes swept over Class 1A, lingering on several students. "However, certain abilities may be uniquely suited to dealing with this threat." Those tired black eyes stopped on Izuku, and suddenly everyone in the hall was looking at him. "Midoriya," Aizawa continued, "your temporal manipulation may be the only thing that can slow these entities down long enough for us to understand what we're dealing with. Are you willing to participate in a field operation?" The question hit Izuku like a physical blow. A real villain situation, not a training exercise or a lucky accident, but an actual emergency where people's lives hung in the balance. And apparently he was the only one who might be able to help. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Good, you'll be accompanied by a tactical team from your class, volunteers who can operate effectively within your temporal fields." Aizawa's gaze swept the room. "This is not a request for glory-seeking. This is potentially lethal field work. Only volunteer if you're certain you can follow orders and work as a team under extreme pressure." Hands went up immediately. Bakugo, predictably. Todoroki with his usual calm determination. Ida with rigid precision. But also Uraraka, Kirishima, even Yaoyorozu with her analytical mindset. Within 5 minutes, a team of 8 had been selected. As they geared up with emergency communication equipment and basic protection gear, All Might pulled Izuku aside. "Young Midoriya," the symbol of peace said quietly, "I need you to understand something. These entities. They're not like anything we've encountered before. My instincts tell me they're connected to your situation somehow." "My situation, your unique abilities, your background." All Might's eyes were serious. "If I'm right, you may be the only person who can truly perceive what these things are." Before Izuku could ask what that meant, they were loading into transport vehicles and racing toward downtown. The affected area looked like a war zone. Buildings showed massive holes where the erosion fields had eaten through concrete and steel. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of streets, their metal bodies partially dissolved. Even the asphalt showed pockmarks and gaps where something had simply deleted chunks of reality. And moving through it all were the entities. Up close, they were even more disturbing than on the news footage. Humanoid shapes that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once, their forms flickering between solid and something else. When they moved, the air around them shimmered with heat distortion, and everything within a few meters began to break down at the atomic level. "Erosion fields approximately 3 meters radius per entity," reported the tactical coordinator through their comm units. "Physical contact results in immediate molecular breakdown. Energy attacks are absorbed and seem to make them stronger." Izuku studied the nearest entity through binoculars, and something deep in his chest reacted with recognition and revulsion. They felt like hollows. Not exactly, these things had different spiritual pressure, different energy signatures, but the underlying wrongness was the same. The sense of beings that existed outside normal reality, feeding on the boundary between life and death. "Midoriya," came Aizawa's voice through the comm. "Can your temporal fields affect them?" I think so." Izuku lowered the binoculars, his mind racing through possibilities. but I'll need to get closer to be sure. Absolutely not, Bakugo's voice cut in sharply. Those things dissolve everything they touch. One mistake and you're dead. If I can slow them down even a little, it might give the pro heroes an opening, Izuku replied. And if not, we need to know what we're dealing with. The team moved forward in formation, with Izuku at the center and the others providing protection and support. As they approached the edge of the affected zone, the wrongness in the air became almost overwhelming. These things were hungry, not for food or energy, but for existence itself. They consumed the boundary between states of being, turning solid matter into void, complex structures into entropy. Contact in 30 seconds, Ida reported, his engines already warming up. Izuku placed both hands on the ground and let his temporal field expand outward, targeting the space around the nearest entity. The effect was immediate and unexpected. Instead of slowing down, the entity seemed to clarify. Its flickering form solidified, becoming more human and somehow more terrible. And when it turned toward their position, Izuku could see its face. It had been human once. Recently. The features were still recognizable, even warped by whatever had transformed it into this holo mockery of life. Target is reacting to temporal field, Yaoyorozu observed, her analytical training kicking in. Form stabilization, increased awareness, possible enhanced aggression. The entity began moving toward them with purpose now, its erosion field leaving a trail of dissolved pavement in its wake. Fall back, Aizawa ordered. Maintain temporal field but increase distance. But as they retreated, more entities began converging on their position. Whatever Izuku's power was doing, it was acting like a beacon, drawing them from across the affected zone. 6-8-12 contacts, Todoroki reported grimly. They're surrounding us. Izuku expanded his field further, creating overlapping zones of temporal manipulation that seemed to stabilize the entities while slowing their approach. But the effort was exhausting, and he could feel the familiar strain that meant he was approaching his limits. I can hold them for maybe 10 minutes, he said through gritted teeth. But they're not slowing down as much as I hoped. That's when Bakugo surprised him. Then we don't slow them down, the blonde said with fierce determination. We speed everything else up. Without waiting for approval, Bakugo launched himself into the air with controlled explosions, moving in the spaces between Izuku's temporal fields where normal time still flowed. His attacks weren't aimed at the entities themselves, but at the environment around them, creating controlled demolitions that brought debris raining down in patterns that herded the creatures away from civilian areas. Bakugo's right, Uraraka realized, activating her own quirk on chunks of rubble. We can't fight them directly, but we can control the battlefield. What followed was the most complex team operation Izuku had ever been part of. While he maintained multiple overlapping temporal fields to slow the entities and protect his teammates, the others worked within and around those fields to create barriers, redirect the creature's movement, and establish safe corridors for civilian evacuation. Todoroki created ice walls that channeled the entities into predictable paths. Ida used his speed to place guidance markers that would help other heroes navigate the temporal distortions. Kirishima and Yaoyorozu worked together to establish hardened defensive positions where rescue workers could operate safely. And through it all, Izuku found himself drawing on memories and tactical knowledge that weren't entirely his own. Baraggan's centuries of experience with spatial control and battlefield management informed every decision, every adjustment to the temporal fields. This is working. Aizawa's voice came through the calm with what might have been surprise. The entities are being funneled into a contained area, and their advance has stopped. But even as he maintained the complex field arrangement, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Not the entities, they were too focused on consuming reality to pay attention to tactics, but something else. Something intelligent and calculating. In the gaps between maintaining his power, he caught glimpses of a figure on a distant rooftop. Too far to make out details, but definitely human. Someone observing the operation with what looked like scientific equipment, someone taking notes. Aizawa-sensei, he said quietly into his comm, there's someone watching us. Rooftop 2 blocks northeast of our position. Confirmed, came the reply after a moment. Unknown individual with monitoring equipment, attempting to approach for identification. But even as heroes moved to investigate, Izuku knew it was too late. Whoever had been watching was gone, vanished as if they'd never been there at all. The cleanup took another 3 hours. Once the entities were contained within Izuku's temporal fields, specialized teams moved in with equipment designed to. Izuku wasn't sure what they did exactly. The technical explanations went over his head, but the result was clear. The entities simply faded away, their forms dissolving back into whatever dimension they'd emerged from. The erosion damage remained, though. Buildings would need to be torn down and rebuilt. Streets would have to be repaved. And several pro-heroes were in the hospital with injuries that doctors were still trying to understand. Preliminary report, Nezu said during the debriefing back at UA. 12 entities neutralized, 0 civilian casualties, minimal property damage beyond the initial affected zone. The tactical use of temporal manipulation to contain rather than destroy the threat was innovative. Izuku slumped in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him like a physical burden. What were those things? They felt almost like, he stopped before saying hollows. That would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. Like what young Midoriya, All Might asked gently. Like they didn't belong in our reality, Izuku finished instead. Like something was forcing them to exist in a space they weren't meant to occupy. That matches our preliminary analysis, Nezu agreed. The question is where they came from and whether we can expect more of them. The answer came sooner than expected. Emergency alerts began flooding in even before the briefing was over, similar entities appearing in Osaka, then Kyoto, then smaller cities across Japan, always in areas with high population density and significant hero presence. It's coordinated, Aizawa said grimly, studying the pattern of incidents. Someone or something is creating these entities and deploying them strategically. But why? Uraraka asked. What's the point of creatures that just consume things? Izuku had a sinking feeling he knew the answer, but it was Yao Yorozu who voiced it first. They're not just consuming matter, she said, her analytical mind putting the pieces together. They're consuming quirk energy. Every hero who's been injured shows signs of quirk factor depletion, not just physical damage. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Someone is harvesting quirk factors, Nezu said quietly, using these entities as collection devices. But for what purpose? Todoroki asked. Before anyone could answer, Izuku's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Impressive work today, Baraggan, but this was just the beginning. I look forward to our proper introduction. His blood went cold. Someone knew who he really was. Someone had been watching not just today's operation, but him specifically. Someone who could create entities that consumed the boundary between life and death, just like hollows. And they wanted to meet him. Midoriya, All Might's voice seemed to come from very far away. What is it? Izuku looked up to find everyone staring at him with concern. His hands were shaking, and he realized he'd been gripping his phone hard enough to crack the screen. I think someone's been watching me specifically, he said carefully. Someone who knows more about my quirk than they should. The message felt like a challenge, a declaration of war wrapped in polite words. And deep in his chest, where Baraggan's memories lived alongside his own determination, Izuku felt an answering spark of royal pride that whispered this insult would not go unanswered. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he just wanted to go home and try to process the fact that somewhere out there, someone was creating artificial hollows for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. Someone who knew exactly who he used to be, and who apparently had plans for who he might become. The second wave hit at dawn. Izuku jerked awake to his phone shrieking emergency alerts, his dreams of bone thrones and ancient battles scattered by the harsh reality of flashing red warnings. 3 more sites across the city, dozens of the erosion entities. And this time they weren't just appearing randomly, they were coordinated, moving in formation like soldiers following orders. He was dressed and out the door in under 5 minutes, his mother's worried voice following him into the hallway. The train to UA was packed with early commuters glued to their phones, watching shaky footage of heroes struggling against creatures that seemed to multiply faster than they could be contained. The footage was worse than yesterday. These entities were different, larger, more aggressive, and apparently capable of some kind of tactical thinking. They moved in groups, flanking heroes who tried to establish perimeters, cutting off escape routes with the methodical precision of a military operation. By the time Izuku reached the emergency assembly point, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. 17 separate incident sites. Aizawa reported grimly, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. Current entity count is over 60 and climbing. Standard containment protocols have failed. The main screen showed a nightmare tableau, heroes retreating from coordinated entity advances, civilians trapped in buildings that were slowly dissolving, entire city blocks being consumed by expanding erosion fields. Even top-ranked heroes like Endeavor and Best Genist were struggling. their usual overwhelming power useless against enemies that absorbed energy attacks and ignored physical force. "Where's All Might?" Bakugo demanded, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Coordinating the evacuation of Shibuya District," Principal Nezu replied. "The entities there are exhibiting new behaviors, specifically targeting hospitals and schools." Izuku felt his stomach drop. These things weren't just consuming reality randomly anymore. They were hunting the most vulnerable populations with deliberate intent. "Student teams will provide support only," Aizawa continued, but his voice carried the weight of someone delivering orders he didn't believe in. However, given yesterday's success with temporal containment, he didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. They were out of options, and Izuku was the only person who'd proven capable of affecting these entities at all. "Sir," Ida raised his hand with military precision, "if Midoriya is our primary tactical asset against these entities, shouldn't we maximize the support team effectiveness?" "What are you suggesting?" "Full class deployment. Coordinated operation using established tactical partnerships." Ida's voice was steady, but Izuku caught the edge of determination underneath. "We've trained together. We know how to work within Midoriya's temporal fields." Aizawa looked like he was about to refuse, but another alert chimed on his tablet. His expression grew even grimmer as he read the update. "Musutafu General Hospital is under siege," he said quietly. 30 entities, expanding erosion field, evacuation impossible due to critical patients who can't be moved." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Hundreds of people who couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but wait while reality dissolved around them. "Full class deployment authorized," Nezu said with the calm of someone making an impossible decision. "All Might is en route to coordinate, move out." The hospital looked like something from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. The parking lot was half gone, consumed by overlapping erosion fields that had turned asphalt into empty space. The building itself was pockmarked with holes where the entities had passed through walls like they were made of tissue paper. And everywhere, that terrible wrongness that made Izuku's teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges. "Entity count confirmed at 32, came All Might's voice through their comm units. He sounded strained in a way Izuku had never heard before. "They're not just randomly consuming anymore, they're systematically destroying structural supports. The building will collapse within the hour." Class 1A took position at the evacuation perimeter, but even from a distance, Izuku could see the problem. The entities had learned from yesterday. Instead of clustering together where his temporal fields could contain them, they were spreading out, creating a net of erosion that made approach impossible. "Standard containment won't work," Todoroki observed, ice crystals forming around his feet as his body unconsciously prepared for combat. "They're too dispersed and they're actively avoiding temporal distortions." Bakugo spat a curse that would have gotten him detention in normal circumstances. "So what, we just watch while they eat a hospital full of people? There has to be something," Uraraka said, but her voice carried the edge of desperation. Some way too, she was cut off by a scream that echoed across the devastated parking lot. Through the holes in the hospital's facade, they could see people, patients in wheelchairs, medical staff, families with children, pressed against windows on the upper floors, watching the erosion fields creep steadily closer. And in that moment, something shifted inside Izuku's chest. The desperate fear that had been driving him since discovering his quirk suddenly felt small, insignificant compared to the weight of responsibility settling over him like a familiar cloak. "These are my subjects," whispered a voice that was his but wasn't, carrying the authority of centuries. "My domain, my people to protect." "No," Izuku said quietly, but his voice carried across the entire group. "This ends now." He started walking toward the hospital, ignoring the shouts of alarm from his classmates and the tactical coordinator's orders to maintain position. The temporal field began expanding around him as he moved, but this time it felt different. Controlled, purposeful, regal. "Midoriya," Aizawa's voice cracked through the comm, "fall back immediately. You're moving into the kill zone." But Izuku wasn't listening anymore. The memories were rising like a tide, and with them came knowledge that his 15-year-old mind had never learned. Techniques that required not just power, but absolute authority over the fundamental forces of time and space. The first entity that moved to intercept him simply stopped. Not slowed, not contained, but frozen in a bubble of temporal stasis that turned it into a living statue. The second suffered a different fate. Izuku gestured dismissively, and centuries of accumulated time crashed down on it all at once, aging it past the point where its artificial existence could maintain cohesion. Holy shit, he heard Bakugo whisper through the comm, and realized his classmates were watching something they'd never seen before. Not the nervous, analytical boy who overthought every decision and apologized for taking up space. This was someone else. Someone who moved with the fluid confidence of absolute certainty, who commanded reality itself with casual gestures that spoke of vast experience and unquestioned authority. Someone who had ruled over death itself for longer than human civilization had existed. Senescentia, temporal dominion, Izuku heard himself say in a voice that resonated with power. Multiple overlapping fields of manipulated time spread outward from his position, each one precisely calibrated for a different purpose. Stasis fields to immobilize entities. Acceleration fields to age their artificial forms past the point of cohesion. Protective bubbles around trapped civilians that would give them hours of subjective time while seconds passed in the real world. It was the most complex application of temporal manipulation anyone had ever documented, executed with the casual ease of someone adjusting room temperature. Midoriya, All Might's voice came through the comm, careful and concerned. Your energy readings are unprecedented. How are you maintaining this level of control? The question pierced through the haze of ancient memory, and for a moment Izuku was just himself again, a 15-year-old boy who'd gotten in way over his head. I don't know, he admitted, but even as he spoke, the fields remained stable. It feels like remembering something I've always known. He continued forward, the entities falling back before his advance like subjects retreating from an approaching king. But as he neared the hospital entrance, something changed in their behavior. Instead of mindlessly consuming everything around them, they began to move with coordinated purpose. They were retreating. Not randomly, but in formation, creating clear paths that led away from the hospital and toward. They're hurting us, Yao Yorozu realized, her analytical mind cutting through the chaos. This isn't random movement, they're trying to channel us toward something. That's when Izuku saw him. Standing on a rooftop 3 blocks away, barely visible against the morning sky, was a figure in a white coat. Too far to make out details, but close enough to see the device in his hands, some kind of tablet or monitoring equipment. And when their eyes met across the distance, the figure raised one hand in what might have been a salute or a mockery of respect. Izuku's phone buzzed. The message was brief, but it hit him like a physical blow. Impressive display, Your Majesty, but you're becoming predictable. The king of Hueco was never meant to serve, only to rule. I can help you remember that. Around him, the temporal fields flickered as his concentration wavered. The entities immediately began pressing forward again, sensing weakness. Midoriya, Bakugo's shout cut through his shock. Whatever just happened, deal with it later. People are dying. The blonde was right, but the message had shaken something fundamental in Izuku's sense of self. Someone knew who he really was. Someone had been watching, planning, manipulating events to force this exact confrontation. Someone who apparently thought he could be turned back into the tyrant he used to be. Never, he thought with fierce determination, and the temporal fields stabilized with renewed strength. I chose to serve, I chose to protect, and I choose who I become. But even as he reestablished control and began systematically neutralizing the remaining entities, part of his mind was analyzing the tactical situation with Baraggan's ancient cunning. Someone was creating artificial hollows, deploying them strategically to force him into increasingly powerful displays of temporal manipulation. The question was why? What did they hope to accomplish by making him use abilities that belonged to a dead king? The answer came as he cleared the last entity from the hospital lobby and began establishing protective fields around the evacuation routes. His classmates were staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to concern, and he realized that somewhere in the past 20 minutes, he'd stopped moving like a nervous teenager and started carrying himself like someone accustomed to command. Like royalty, Deku, Bakugo said quietly, using the old nickname with unusual seriousness. What the hell was that? What do you mean? You know what I mean. The way you moved, the way you talked, the way you looked at those things like they were insects that had dared to enter your presence. Bakugo's red eyes were sharp with analysis. That wasn't you. That was someone else. Before Izuku could figure out how to respond to that, his phone buzzed again. The evacuation is complete. You've served your purpose for today, but remember, Your Majesty, a king's nature cannot be suppressed forever. Eventually, you will have to choose between the pretense of heroism and the reality of your power. I'll be waiting when you do. This time there was an attachment. A photo taken from somewhere high above the hospital, showing Izuku standing in the center of multiple overlapping temporal fields, his posture straight and commanding, his expression carrying an authority that belonged to someone far older than 15. He looked like a king surveying his domain, and that terrified him more than any villain ever could. Midoriya, All Might's voice came through the calm, gentle but insistent, "We need to debrief. There are questions about your performance today." Izuku looked around at his classmates, at the saved hospital, at the evidence of power he'd barely understood he possessed. The weight of 2 lifetimes pressed down on him, and for the first time since discovering the truth about his reincarnation, he wondered if he was strong enough to carry it. But looking at Uraraka's relieved smile, at Ida's respectful admiration, at even Bakugo's grudging approval, he knew one thing for certain. He would not become the tyrant he used to be. No matter what anyone said, no matter what memories surfaced, no matter what power flowed through him. The king of Hueco was dead. Midoriya Izuku would choose his own path, even if it meant fighting a war against his own nature to do it. The silence in All Might's private office was deafening. Izuku sat in the oversized chair across from the symbol of peace's desk, acutely aware of Bakugo leaning against the wall behind him like a barely contained explosion. They'd been sitting like this for 5 minutes now, ever since All Might had dismissed everyone else from the post-operation briefing with a pointed look that suggested this conversation was going to be very private and very difficult. The readings from today's operation, All Might began carefully, setting down a tablet covered in energy signatures and temporal measurements, are unprecedented, not just in scale but in sophistication. The level of control you demonstrated over multiple complex fields simultaneously suggests training and experience that should be impossible for a 15-year-old. Izuku stared at his hands, trying to find words for something that sounded insane even to him. "Deku," Bakugo's voice cut through his hesitation like a blade. "I've known you since we were 4 years old. I've seen you analyze hero fights, break down quirk applications, overthink every decision until you tie yourself in knots. What I saw today wasn't analysis or overthinking." The blonde pushed off from the wall and moved into Izuku's line of sight, his red eyes intense with the focus he usually reserved for combat. "Today you moved like someone who'd been fighting for decades. You looked at those things like you'd seen them before. And when you used your quirk," Bakugo paused, something almost like uncertainty flickering across his features. "You carried yourself like you owned the entire world and were just deciding whether to let the rest of us live in it." The description hit too close to home. Izuku closed his eyes, feeling the weight of memories that weren't quite his own pressing against his consciousness. "Tell us, young Midoriya," All Might said gently. "What aren't you telling us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Izuku could lie, deflect, try to buy more time to figure out how to explain something that defied explanation. But looking at these 2 people, one who represented everything he wanted to become, and one who'd known him longer than anyone, he realized he was tired of carrying this secret alone. "My name," he said quietly, "used to be Baraggan Louis Sainbairn." Bakugo blinked. "What the fuck does that mean?" "It means," Izuku continued, his voice growing stronger, "that I'm not experiencing a late manifesting quirk. I'm remembering abilities I had in a previous life, as the king of Hueco. He looked up to gauge their reactions. All Might was leaning forward with professional interest, his expression serious but not disbelieving. Bakugo looked like someone had just told him the laws of physics were actually suggestions. "Previous life," All Might repeated carefully, "as in reincarnation. I know how it sounds. But those dreams I mentioned, the ones about the throne room, they're memories. And my quirk isn't temporal manipulation, it's senescentia, the power over aging and time that I wielded as an immortal king." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but also oddly liberating. Like setting down a weight he'd been carrying for weeks. "King of what now?" Bakugo demanded. "Hueco, the realm between life and death, populated by beings called hollows, spirits that had lost their way and become monsters." Izuku rubbed his temples where a familiar ache was building. "I ruled there for, I don't know, centuries. Time worked differently, and I was not a good king." "Define not good," All Might said with the patience of someone accustomed to extracting difficult truths from reluctant students. "I was a tyrant. I ruled through fear and overwhelming power, convinced that my authority over time made me superior to all other forms of life." The admission tasted like ash in his mouth. "I saw other beings as subjects at best, insects at worst. I used my power to prove dominance rather than to protect anyone." Bakugo was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "So what changed?" he asked finally. If you were this all-powerful immortal asshole, how did you end up as quirkless Deku who cries at hero documentaries? Despite everything, Izuku almost smiled at the blunt assessment. I died. I was defeated by a hero, someone who used my own power against me through clever tactics and binding techniques. And in those final moments, when I was facing true death for the first time in centuries, he paused, remembering the clarity that had come with dissolution. I realized I'd wasted everything, all that power all that time, and I'd used it for nothing but my own pride. And now you're back, All Might said, with another chance. Apparently. Though I'm not sure why or who decided I deserved one. The office fell quiet again as both men absorbed this revelation. Finally, Bakugo spoke up with typical directness. Those things from today, the erosion entities. You recognized them. It wasn't a question. They felt like artificial hollows, Izuku admitted. Not exactly the same, but similar enough that my old instincts kicked in. That's why I could affect them when other heroes couldn't. Someone made fake hollows, All Might said slowly, and deployed them in a way that would force you to use your previous life's abilities. Someone who knows who I really am, Izuku agreed, pulling out his phone to show them the messages. Someone who's been watching me, studying me, trying to, I don't know, push me back toward what I used to be. Bakugo read the messages with growing anger, his hands starting to spark with small explosions. This psychopath thinks he can turn you back into some kind of undead dictator, he snarled. What's his game? I don't know, but those entities are just the beginning. The messages suggest he has bigger plans, and he seems convinced that I'll eventually choose power over heroism. All Might stood and moved to the window overlooking the training grounds, his expression troubled. Young Midoriya, he said without turning around, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When you were using your abilities today, when you displayed that level of power and authority, how did it feel? The question Izuku had been dreading. Natural, he admitted quietly. Like stepping into clothes that fit perfectly. For those few minutes, I wasn't a nervous 15-year-old trying to figure out his place in the world. I was someone who'd commanded armies, who'd shaped reality with a thought, who'd never doubted his right to make life and death decisions for others. And, Bakugo pressed. And it felt, Izuku struggled to find words for something so complex. It felt like coming home, and that terrifies me more than any villain ever could. All Might turned back to face them, his expression grave but not condemning. Fear is appropriate, he said simply. Power without restraint, authority without accountability, these things corrupt even the best intentions. But the fact that you're afraid of that corruption, that you recognize the danger. He paused, studying Izuku's face. That suggests you've already chosen which path you want to walk. Have I? Because when I was out there today, when I saw those people in danger, there was a moment where I stopped being Midoriya Izuku and started being. He swallowed hard. Started being the king of Komundo again. But you didn't stay there, Bakugo pointed out with surprising insight. You could have kept going, could have used that power to dominate instead of just protect. But you pulled back, this time. But what about next time? What if the situation gets worse? What if I have to choose between saving people and staying true to who I want to be? Then you choose saving people, All Might said firmly, and you trust your friends to help you stay grounded. Power doesn't have to corrupt, young Midoriya, not if you remember why you wanted to be a hero in the first place. Before Izuku could respond, an alert chimed on All Might's computer. The hero checked it quickly and his expression darkened. What is it? Bakugo asked. Intelligence report. We've identified the source of today's entities. All Might turned the screen so they could see a file photo of a middle-aged man in a lab coat. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, formerly Dr. Holo, a researcher who was expelled from the Hero Commission's Science Division 3 years ago for illegal experimentation. Izuku studied the photo, feeling a chill of recognition. This was the figure he'd glimpsed on the rooftop, the one who'd been watching his performance with such intense interest. What kind of experiments? He asked. Quirk replication and enhancement with a focus on death-related abilities. According to his file, he was obsessed with the theoretical boundaries between life, death, and artificial existence. All Might closed the file. He disappeared after his expulsion, along with several pieces of advanced research equipment. And now he's making artificial hollows and using them to study me, Izuku concluded. But why? Maybe he thinks your power is the key to whatever he's trying to achieve, Bakugo suggested. Or maybe he's just another psycho who wants to dissect something unique. All Might's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He answered it with professional efficiency, but his expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. Understood, we'll be ready. He ended the call and looked at both boys with serious concern. That was Principal Nezu. Intelligence suggests Dr. Holo is planning something significant for tomorrow night, something that will require unprecedented coordination between multiple agencies. What kind of something? Izuku asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Unknown, but preliminary reports suggest he's been gathering data not just on your abilities, but on the abilities of every hero who's encountered his entities. He's building a comprehensive database of quirk factors and their interactions with artificial spiritual constructs. The implications were chilling. Dr. Holo wasn't just studying Izuku's power, he was mapping the entire hero system's capabilities and weaknesses. So what's the plan? Bakugo asked with the eagerness of someone who finally had a clear target for his frustration. The plan, All Might said carefully, is for you two to continue your normal training while the professionals handle the investigation. Both boys started to protest, but All Might held up a hand. However, he continued, given the personal nature of Dr. Holo's interest in young Midoriya, and given today's demonstration of unique capabilities against his constructs, I suspect that may not be realistic. Izuku felt something cold settle in his stomach. You think he's going to come for me directly? I think he's been building up to something specific, and you're the centerpiece. All Might's expression was grim but determined. Which is why we're going to be ready for him. The meeting continued for another hour, covering security protocols, communication procedures, and contingency plans. But underneath the tactical discussion, Izuku could feel the weight of his revelation changing the dynamic between the three of them. All Might now looked at him with a mixture of paternal concern and professional wariness, someone trying to balance mentorship with the reality of training a former tyrant. Bakugo's competitive drive had evolved into something more complex, a fascination with power coupled with genuine concern for his childhood friend. And Izuku himself felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because the secret was finally out, heavier because now he had to live up to the trust these people were placing in him. As they prepared to leave, Bakugo lingered behind. Deku, he said quietly, using the old nickname with unusual gentleness. That thing you said about feeling like you were coming home when you used your full power. Yeah, I get it. When I'm really cutting loose with my explosions, when I'm pushing my quirk to its absolute limits, there's this moment where it feels like I could blow up the whole world just because I wanted to. Bakugo's red eyes were serious. But that feeling, that's not who we are, that's just what the power feels like. How do you know the difference? Because when the fight's over, when the adrenaline fades, what matters isn't how strong you felt. It's who you chose to protect. It was perhaps the most insightful thing Bakugo had ever said to him, and it hit harder than any training session or lecture. As they walked back toward the dorms, Izuku felt something settle into place in his chest. He was Midoriya Izuku, aspiring hero. He was also Baraggan Louis Saint-Bern reincarnated king. But most importantly, he was someone who chose every day to use his power in service of others rather than in pursuit of dominance. The path forward was still uncertain, and Dr. Holo's plans remained unknown. But for the first time since discovering the truth about his reincarnation, Izuku felt like he might actually be strong enough to walk it. Even if it meant fighting a war against both his old nature and a madman who wanted to bring that nature back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, he was just a student walking back to his dorm with his friends, carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes but choosing to build something better with them. And that felt like enough. The new training regimen made Izuku's previous sessions look like warm-up exercises. Dr. Temporal had redesigned the entire program after reviewing footage from the hospital incident, and the results were both fascinating and exhausting. Instead of simple field control, they were now working on what she called integrated temporal combat, techniques that combined his senescentia abilities with conventional hero movement and tactics. The goal, she explained as Izuku caught his breath after the latest drill, is to make your temporal manipulation feel as natural as walking. Right now, you're still thinking of it as a separate ability that you activate when needed. But for someone with your level of power, it should be more like breathing. Izuku wiped sweat from his forehead and tried not to think about how that description reminded him of Baraggan's casual dominance over time itself. The ancient king had never consciously activated senescentia, it had simply been part of his existence, as fundamental as his heartbeat. Let's try the movement drill again, Dr. Temporal said, adjusting the settings on her monitoring equipment. This time, I want you to maintain a low-level temporal field while using enhanced movement techniques. The drill was deceptively simple in concept. Navigate an obstacle course while keeping a precise 1-meter temporal field active around his body. In practice, it required splitting his attention between physical coordination and power control in ways that pushed both to their limits. Izuku settled into a ready stance and let the familiar weight of senescentia settle around him like a cloak. The field that formed was subtle, barely visible except for the slight shimmer it created in the air, but perfectly controlled. Then he moved. What followed was unlike anything he'd experienced before. With the temporal field active, his perception of the world shifted. Obstacles became predictable, their movement patterns mapped out in slow motion. His own reflexes felt impossibly sharp, each motion flowing into the next with fluid precision. But more than that, he could feel the integration happening in real time. Baraggan's centuries of experience with spatial awareness and combat movement were bleeding through, but filtered through his own moral framework and heroic intentions. "Remarkable," Dr. Temporal murmured, checking her readings. "Your movement efficiency has increased by 30%, and your field stability is actually improving under physical stress." "It feels," Izuku paused, trying to find words for the sensation. "Like the power wants to be used this way, like it's more stable when it's serving a purpose rather than just existing." "That matches the theoretical framework for ability soul integration," she replied, making notes on her tablet. "Powers that carry emotional or ethical imprints respond better to uses that align with those imprints." Before Izuku could ask what that meant, the training ground doors burst open and Class 1A poured in with their usual mix of enthusiasm and barely controlled chaos. "Deku," Uraraka called out, jogging over with a bright smile that made something warm flutter in his chest. Dr. Temporal said, "We're doing team integration training today." Behind her, the rest of his classmates were spreading out across the training ground with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to work together under pressure. After the hospital incident, something had shifted in their dynamic. The wariness was gone, replaced by the kind of tactical trust that came from seeing someone choose to protect others even when it cost them. "Team integration?" Izuku asked Dr. Temporal. "Your abilities are most effective when supporting others," she explained. "So we're going to practice coordinated operations where your temporal manipulation enhances your classmates' quirks rather than replacing them." What followed was the most complex training exercise Izuku had ever participated in. The scenario was deceptively straightforward. A multi-story building with civilians trapped on different floors, structural damage preventing normal rescue approaches, and a time limit that made careful planning impossible. But instead of working around Izuku's abilities, his classmates had developed tactics that incorporated temporal manipulation as a core element. Bakugo used controlled explosions to create entry points, then relied on Izuku's time drag fields to slow the resulting debris and prevent secondary collapses. Todoroki's ice constructions became mobile platforms when temporal acceleration let him shape them faster than physics normally allowed. Even Minata's sticky spheres became tactical tools when time manipulation let them be placed with surgical precision. "This is incredible," Yaoyorozu said during a brief break, her analytical mind clearly working through the tactical implications. "We're not just operating despite your abilities, we're operating because of them. It's like having a force multiplier that adapts to whatever strategy we need." "It feels natural," Ida added with characteristic precision. "Your temporal fields don't interfere with our techniques, they enhance them in ways that feel almost intuitive." Watching his classmates work with such seamless coordination around his abilities, Izuku felt something he hadn't experienced since discovering his reincarnation. Not the ancient authority of kingship, but the modern satisfaction of true teamwork, of power used in service of something larger than himself. That feeling lasted exactly 15 minutes. The attack came without warning, a figure in white dropping through the training ground's skylight with inhuman grace. Dr. Holo looked exactly like his intelligence photo, but there was something fundamentally wrong with his presence. The air around him shimmered with the same distortion effect as his artificial entities, and when he moved, reality seemed to struggle to keep up. "Impressive work," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the training ground despite the distance. "But still limited by your attachment to these collaborators." Class 1A immediately shifted into defensive formation, but Dr. Holo raised a hand in a gesture that was almost casual. "I'm not here to fight your friends, Your Majesty. I'm here to make you an offer." The title hit Izuku like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of memories and authority he'd been trying to suppress. Around him, his classmates tensed, recognizing the shift in atmosphere even if they didn't understand its source. "I don't want to hear your offers," Izuku said, stepping forward to place himself between Dr. Holo and his friends. "Oh, but you should. You see, I've been studying your recent activities, and I've noticed something interesting." Dr. Holo pulled out a tablet, swiping through what looked like energy readings and tactical analyses. "Your power is being wasted on rescue work and defensive applications, constrained by arbitrary moral limitations that serve no purpose except to make others comfortable with your existence." "Those aren't limitations," Izuku replied, feeling his temporal field beginning to stir in response to his rising anger. "They're choices, are they? Let me show you something." Dr. Holo tapped his tablet, and a holographic display appeared in the air above the training ground, footage from the hospital incident but not the sanitized version that had appeared on the news. This showed everything, the full scope of Izuku's power, the casual authority with which he'd commanded reality itself, the moment when he'd looked more like an immortal king than a teenage hero. "This is what you really are," Dr. Holo continued with scientific fascination. "A being capable of absolute dominion over time and space, reduced to playing support for children with parlor tricks." "My friends aren't," Izuku started, but Dr. Holo cut him off. "Your subjects perhaps, but friends, equals." The man's smile was cold and clinical. "Look at them, Your Majesty. Look at how they position themselves around you, not beside you but behind you. They know what you are even if they won't admit it." Despite himself, Izuku glanced back at his classmates. They were indeed arrayed behind him, but their expressions showed determination and trust rather than fear or subservience. "They trust me to protect them," he said firmly. "They expect you to protect them," Dr. Holo corrected. "There's a difference. And when the time comes, when the choice is between their safety and your principles, you'll choose power over restraint. You'll choose dominion over cooperation." "No, I won't." "Really? Then let me give you a demonstration of what that choice looks like." Dr. Holo pressed something on his tablet, and the training ground security system activated. Emergency barriers slammed down, sealing all the exits and trapping Class 1A inside. But that wasn't the real threat. From vents hidden throughout the room came a familiar yellow gas, the same neurotoxin that had appeared during their team exercise simulation, except this time it was real. "A simple choice, Your Majesty," Dr. Holo said as the gas began to spread. "You can save your friends using the gentle, restrained applications of power you've developed. But the gas is designed to disperse faster than those techniques can neutralize it." Around the room, Izuku's classmates were already moving into crisis formation, but he could see the growing alarm in their eyes as they recognized the smell and color of genuine toxin. "Or," Dr. Holo continued, "you can embrace what you really are. Use your full power, your true authority over time and death. Stop restraining yourself for their comfort and save them the way a king saves his subjects, through overwhelming force." The choice was designed to be impossible. Save his friends through methods that would turn him back into the tyrant he used to be, or watch them suffer because he refused to abandon his principles. Except Dr. Holo had made one critical error in his analysis. He'd assumed Izuku was still fighting alone. "Bakugo," Izuku said quietly, not taking his eyes off Dr. Holo. "Controlled detonation northwest vent cluster." "On it," came the immediate reply, followed by the sharp crack of precisely placed explosions. "Todoroki, ice seal on the remaining vents. Uraraka, get everyone to the center of the room." His classmates moved with the fluid coordination of a team that had trained together for months, trusting his tactical assessment without question or hesitation. And that trust gave Izuku the clarity he needed to see the real solution. Instead of trying to neutralize the gas with overwhelming temporal force, he created something else entirely, a preservation field that locked the breathable air around his classmates in temporal stasis while allowing the toxin to age harmlessly in the spaces between. It was precise, controlled, and completely within the ethical boundaries he'd established for himself. More importantly, it was a technique that relied on cooperation rather than domination, on protecting life rather than asserting authority. "Impossible," Dr. Holo whispered, staring at his readings with genuine shock. "The energy expenditure should be. The complexity required to maintain that many discrete fields is manageable," Izuku finished calmly, "when you're not trying to do everything alone." The technique was exhausting, but it was sustainable because his classmates were actively working with him rather than simply being protected by him. Bakugo's explosions created pressure differentials that helped contain the gas. Todoroki's ice provided physical barriers that reduced the area Izuku needed to cover. Even Mineta's spheres became anchor points for temporal stability. "This isn't how it's supposed to work," Dr. Holo said, and for the first time his clinical composure cracked to reveal genuine frustration. "Kings don't collaborate, they command, they dominate, they rule through strength, not through friendship." "Maybe that's why the first king of Hueco-Mundo died," Izuku replied with quiet certainty. "Because he never learned that real strength comes from lifting others up, not standing above them." The gas was fully contained now, aging into harmless compounds within Izuku's carefully controlled fields. His classmates were safe, the crisis was resolved, and Dr. Holo's test had failed completely. But the man wasn't finished. "You think you've won?" he asked, pulling out what looked like a remote detonator. This was never about the gas. This was about proving a point. He pressed the button, and every screen in the training ground lit up with the same image, surveillance footage from across the city, showing dozens of locations where his artificial entities were emerging. Schools, hospitals, residential areas, all under simultaneous attack by creatures that regular heroes couldn't effectively combat. "Enjoy your principles, Your Majesty," Dr. Holo said as he activated some kind of teleportation device. "Let's see how many people die while you maintain your ethical boundaries." He vanished, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and the horrifying reality of his final gambit. On the screens, emergency alerts were already flooding in. Hundreds of entities, thousands of potential casualties, and only one person in the entire city who'd proven capable of stopping them effectively. "We have to go," Uraraka said urgently, checking her phone as evacuation alerts filled the display. "The entire city is under attack." "Not we," Izuku replied with grim determination. "Me." This is what he's been building up to, a citywide crisis that can only be resolved through the kind of overwhelming temporal manipulation that would turn me back into what I used to be. "Like hell you're going alone," Bakugo snarled, small explosions already popping around his hands. "We're a team, remember? That's the whole point of what just happened." "Bakugo's right," Ida added with formal precision. "The effectiveness of your abilities is maximized through coordinated support. Attempting to handle this crisis alone would be both tactically unsound and contrary to everything we've learned about optimal team dynamics." Looking at his classmates, at their determination, their trust, their absolute refusal to let him carry this burden alone, Izuku felt something click into place. Not the ancient authority of kingship, but something better. The modern strength that came from choosing to serve others, even when you had the power to rule them. "All right," he said, pulling out his phone to coordinate with the crisis response team. "But we do this my way. No unnecessary risks, no heroic sacrifices, and nobody tries to prove anything to anybody." "What's the plan?" Yaoyorozu asked, already mentally cataloging the resources they'd need. Izuku studied the deployment patterns on the emergency feeds, his tactical analysis enhanced by centuries of battlefield experience, but guided by principles he'd chosen for himself. "We save everyone," he said simply. "All of them, and we do it without compromising who we've chosen to be." It was an impossible task by any reasonable measure. But as his classmates began coordinating their response with the seamless efficiency of people who trusted each other completely, Izuku felt something he'd never experienced as an immortal king. Hope, not the desperate hope of someone clinging to power, but the steady confidence of someone who'd learned that true strength was measured not by what you could take, but by what you chose to give. Dr. Holo had designed this crisis to force him back into tyranny. Instead, it was going to prove once and for all that the king of Hueco-Mundo was dead, and Midoriya Izuku had chosen to become something infinitely better. The city looked like a war zone. From the emergency response helicopter, Izuku could see the scope of Dr. Holo's final gambit spread out below them like a malignant constellation. 17 separate incident sites, each marked by the telltale shimmer of erosion fields and the chaotic movement of evacuation vehicles. But this wasn't the random deployment pattern from previous attacks. This was strategic, surgical, designed to overwhelm the hero system's capacity to respond. Hospital complex, downtown financial district, 3 separate schools, the main transportation hub, and multiple residential areas. Principal Nezu reported through the comm system, his usually calm voice carrying an edge of strain. "Current entity count is approaching 200. Civilian evacuation is proceeding, but we estimate at least 15,000 people are still within the affected zones. 15,000 lives hanging in the balance, and the only person who'd proven capable of stopping these things was a 15-year-old boy carrying the memories of an ancient tyrant. No pressure at all. ETA to first target site. Izuku asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he checked his gear one final time. The specialized support equipment Dr. Temporal had developed was lighter than expected, but he could feel the weight of responsibility settling over him like a familiar cloak. 3 minutes, the pilot replied. But kid, I gotta ask, how are you planning to handle 17 sites simultaneously, even with hero support? That's impossible by conventional standards. Ida finished from the seat across from him, his expression serious but determined. Which is why we're not using conventional tactics. The plan they developed during the flight was ambitious to the point of lunacy, but it was built on months of training together and the hard-won understanding of how Izuku's abilities could enhance rather than replace conventional hero work. Instead of trying to clear each site individually, they were going to create overlapping networks of temporal fields across the entire city. Multiple teams working within synchronized time zones, with Izuku providing the temporal infrastructure that would let other heroes operate at maximum efficiency. Temporal coordination on this scale has never been attempted, Yao Yorozu added, her analytical mind clearly running through contingencies and failure scenarios. The energy expenditure alone should be manageable, Izuku interrupted, and the confidence in his voice surprised even him. I know what I can do now, and more importantly, I know what we can do together. The helicopter began its descent toward the first target site, Musutafu Elementary, where 60 entities had surrounded the building in a pattern that prevented conventional evacuation. Through the window, Izuku could see children's faces pressed against classroom windows, teachers holding them back from the glass as reality dissolved in the courtyard below. Remember, Aizawa's voice crackled through the comm from the Ground Coordination Center, this is a rescue operation, not a combat mission. Priority 1 is civilian safety. Priority 2 is entity containment. Do not engage in unnecessary heroics. The words were meant for all of them, but Izuku caught the specific weight behind them. Don't get lost in the power. Don't let Baraggan's memories override your judgment. Stay focused on saving people, not proving dominance. Understood, he replied, and meant it. The helicopter touched down in the school's parking lot, far enough from the erosion fields to be safe but close enough for rapid deployment. As Class 1A disembarked, Izuku could see the entities reacting to his presence, their forms becoming more solid, more focused, as if his temporal signature was calling to them. They're definitely drawn to you specifically, Todoroki observed, ice already forming around his feet as his body prepared for combat. Which could be an advantage if we can use it to control their positioning, or a massive problem if they all converge on our location, Bakugo pointed out with typical bluntness, explosions starting to pop around his hands. Then we don't give them the chance, Izuku said, settling into the centered state that had become second nature over months of training. Everyone ready? Nods all around, expressions serious but not afraid. They'd trained for this. They'd prepared for this. And most importantly, they trusted each other to pull it off. Izuku placed both hands on the asphalt and let his power expand. But this time, instead of the focused fields he'd used in previous encounters, he created something unprecedented. A network of interconnected temporal zones that spread across multiple city blocks. Each zone was calibrated differently. Acceleration fields to break down the entity's artificial cohesion, stasis bubbles to protect trapped civilians, time drag areas to slow falling debris and prevent secondary collapses. The complexity was staggering, like conducting a symphony where every instrument required individual attention while maintaining perfect harmony with the whole. But Izuku had advantages now that he'd lacked in previous encounters. Months of training with Dr. Temporal had given him conscious control over techniques that Baraggan had wielded through instinct alone. His classmates' coordinated support reduced the tactical burden, letting him focus on power management rather than trying to solve every problem personally. And most importantly, he understood his purpose now, not to dominate the battlefield, but to create the conditions for others to succeed. Network established, he reported through the comm, sweat already beading on his forehead from the effort of maintaining so many discrete fields. All teams, you have temporal support across the entire operational area. The response was immediate. Heroes who'd been stymied by the entity's defensive properties suddenly found their attacks landing with devastating effectiveness. Evacuation teams moved with superhuman coordination as time itself bent to give them extra seconds when they needed them most. Even the entities themselves became predictable, their movements slowed just enough for tactical planning. This is incredible, came All Might's voice from across the city, where he was leading efforts at the hospital complex. It's like having extra time whenever we need it most. But even as the operation proceeded with unprecedented efficiency, Izuku could feel the strain building. Maintaining this many fields across such a wide area was pushing his abilities toward their absolute limits. His hands were starting to shake, his vision blurring around the edges as exhaustion crept in. More whispered a voice in the back of his mind that sounded suspiciously like Baraggan's ancient authority. You can do more. Stop holding back and embrace what you really are. Status report, Aizawa's voice cut through the temptation with professional clarity. 7 sites cleared, 10 in progress, Izuku replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Entity count down to 137. And your condition? Izuku considered lying, claiming he could maintain this indefinitely. But the truth was he could feel his limits approaching like a wall rushing toward him at highway speed. I can hold the network for maybe another 20 minutes, he admitted. After that, I'll need to scale back to single-site operations. Copy that. All teams priority shift to high-risk locations. We need to maximize civilian evacuations while temporal support is available. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of coordinated heroism. Teams that had trained separately for months suddenly moved like parts of a single organism, their individual abilities enhanced by the temporal framework Izuku provided. Civilians were evacuated with impossible speed and precision. Entities that had seemed unstoppable became manageable obstacles. But as they approached the final sites, Dr. Holo played his last card. Midoriya, Uraraka's voice cracked through the comm with genuine alarm. Something's wrong with the entities at the downtown site. They're not just consuming matter anymore, they're generating some kind of field effect. Through the tactical feeds, Izuku could see what she meant. The remaining entities had clustered together in the city's financial district, their individual erosion fields merging into something much worse. Instead of simply aging matter to dust, they were creating expanding zones of pure entropy, areas where the fundamental forces that held reality together were breaking down. Energy readings are off the charts, came Dr. Temporal's voice from the monitoring station. If that field continues to expand, it will create a cascade failure that could affect the entire metropolitan area. How long do we have? All Might asked. At current expansion rate, maybe 6 minutes before it reaches critical mass. 6 minutes to prevent a catastrophe that could kill millions. And the only solution required the kind of overwhelming temporal manipulation that would push Izuku far beyond safe limits. I can stop it, he said quietly, studying the feeds and running calculations based on Baraggan's experience with large-scale reality manipulation. But I'll need to create a temporal implosion field, collapsing time around the entropy zone to contain the effect. That's never been attempted before, Dr. Temporal said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was proposing. The energy requirements alone will probably age me significantly, Izuku finished. I know, but if I don't try, everyone dies anyway. The comm channel fell silent as the implications sank in. Using that level of power would mean accepting permanent physical consequences, possibly decades of accelerated aging, possibly worse. There has to be another way, Uraraka said desperately. There isn't, Izuku's voice was calm, certain. This is what I trained for, what I was given a second chance to do. Deku, Bakugo's voice cut through the tactical chatter with uncharacteristic gentleness. Are you sure about this? I'm sure. And surprisingly, he was. Looking at the crisis unfolding across the city, at the thousands of people counting on heroes to protect them, Izuku felt something settle into place that had been building since the day he'd first activated his quirk. This was why he'd been reborn, not to be a king again, but to choose service over dominion when it mattered most. All teams fall back to minimum safe distance, he ordered, already beginning to redirect his temporal network toward the downtown site. I'm going to try something that's never been done before. Wait, came All Might's voice, heavy with paternal concern. Young Midoriya, if this goes wrong, it won't, Izuku interrupted with quiet confidence. Because I'm not doing it alone. He looked around at his classmates, at the teammates who'd stood with him through every challenge, who'd helped him find the balance between power and principle. Everyone who's worked within my fields knows how they feel, how they respond to cooperative intent, he continued. I need you to maintain that connection while I attempt the implosion. Your presence in the network will help me stay grounded, stay focused on protection rather than destruction. It wasn't standard tactical doctrine. It wasn't safe by any conventional measure. But as his classmates moved into position around him, their expressions showing determination rather than fear, Izuku knew they could pull it off. Because they weren't just a hero team anymore. They were something rarer and more powerful, a group of people who'd learned to trust each other completely, even when the stakes were impossibly high. Network reconfiguration beginning, Izuku announced, feeling the familiar weight of senescentia settling around him like a mantle of authority. But this time, instead of the crushing responsibility of ruling alone, it felt like the shared burden of choosing to serve others. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since discovering his reincarnation, Izuku felt truly ready for it. Not because he was strong enough to handle it alone, but because he'd learned something the first king of Komundo had never understood. True power wasn't about standing above others, it was about lifting them up. Even if it cost everything you had. The temporal implosion began as a whisper. Izuku knelt in the center of what had once been Musutafu's financial district, his hands pressed against concrete that was already starting to age under the influence of his expanding power. Around him, his classmates maintained their positions at the edge of the safe zone, their presence in his temporal network providing the emotional anchor he needed to attempt something that had never been tried before. The entropy field downtown pulsed like a malignant heart, each beat sending waves of dissolution rippling outward. Buildings didn't just crumble, they unraveled at the molecular level, their very existence questioned by forces that belonged in the space between dimensions. And it was growing, field expansion accelerating, came Dr. Temporal's voice through the comm, tight with professional concern. Current estimate is 4 minutes to cascade failure, 4 minutes to prevent the end of everything he'd sworn to protect. Izuku closed his eyes and reached deeper into his power than he'd ever gone before, past the careful limitations he'd constructed, past the safety protocols Dr. Temporal had drilled into him, into the realm where Baraggan's ancient authority waited with patient confidence. Now you understand, the memory voice whispered with satisfaction. This is what true power feels like. Stop pretending to be something you're not. But as the familiar weight of absolute temporal dominion settled over him, Izuku felt something else. The steady presence of his classmates maintaining their connection to his network, their trust and determination flowing through the temporal bonds like warmth through winter. He wasn't accessing this power to prove his superiority or assert his dominance. He was using it because people were counting on him, because this was what heroes did when everything else failed. No, he thought back to the ancient voice. This is what true power is for. The temporal implosion field began as a point of infinite complexity, a space where time folded in on itself like origami made of reality. But instead of the chaotic destruction Baraggan would have created, this was precise, surgical, designed not to destroy but to contain. Energy readings are, Dr. Temporal's voice faltered. I've never seen anything like this. The temporal mathematics alone should be impossible to maintain. Izuku felt the strain immediately. Creating a stable implosion field required maintaining thousands of intersecting temporal vectors simultaneously, each one calibrated to compress the entropy effect without allowing it to cascade into neighboring areas. It was like performing brain surgery while conducting a symphony while solving calculus problems, all at speeds that pushed human consciousness to its absolute limits. But he wasn't working alone. Through the network, he could feel his classmates' presence, Bakugo's fierce determination, Uraraka's unwavering faith, Ida's precise tactical thinking, Todoroki's calm analytical assessment. They weren't just observing. They were actively participating, their individual strengths feeding into the temporal matrix and providing stability he couldn't have achieved solo. It's working, Yaoyorozu reported with wonder in her voice. The entropy field is contracting. You're actually pulling it back into containment. The technique was working, but the cost was immediate and visible. Izuku could feel years of his life burning away like fuel in a furnace, his cellular structure aging under the stress of channeling power that belonged to an immortal being. Gray streaks appeared in his green hair, lines formed around his eyes. His hands, pressed against the aging concrete, began to show the weathering of decades. Stop, urged a voice that was entirely his own. You're killing yourself. So, replied the part of him that was ancient and royal and had learned too late what truly mattered. What is one life weighed against millions? What is personal preservation compared to the duty of protection? For the first time since his reincarnation, the two aspects of his identity were in perfect agreement. But the entropy field wasn't the only threat. Midoriya, Uraraka's warning came just as a new signature appeared on the temporal network, something vast and cold and completely artificial dropping from the sky like a falling star. Dr. Holo's final gambit wasn't just the entropy field. It was himself, transformed by his own research into something that barely qualified as human anymore. He descended through the air in a sphere of anti-temporal energy. his form flickering between dimensions as his artificial holo modifications fought against the laws of physics. "Magnificent," he called out as he landed just outside the implosion field's event horizon. "This is what I wanted to see, the true power of the King of Mundo, unleashed without restraint." "I'm not him anymore," Izuku replied without taking his concentration off the delicate work of containing the entropy cascade. "I chose to be someone else. Did you? Look at yourself, Your Majesty, look at what you're becoming." Dr. Holo gestured, and mirrors of polished metal rose from the ground around Izuku. In them, he could see what the temporal strain was doing to his body, aging him decades in minutes, transforming the face of a 15-year-old hero into something that belonged to a man who'd lived through wars and hardships. "You're burning away your youth, your future, your very humanity to save a world that will never truly accept you," Dr. Holo continued with clinical fascination. "How is that different from what Baraggan would have done? How is self-destruction for others any less tyrannical than destruction of others for self?" The question hit harder than any physical attack because it contained a grain of twisted truth. Izuku was sacrificing everything, making unilateral decisions about his own life and future to protect people who would never know what he'd given up for them. But as he struggled with the philosophical trap, Bakugo's voice cut through the doubt with typical directness. "Hey, asshole," the blonde shouted at Dr. Holo while launching himself into the air with controlled explosions. The difference is that he chose to do it, instead of choosing to force other people to do it for him. The attack was perfectly timed, not at Dr. Holo himself, who was protected by his anti-temporal field, but at the equipment he was using to monitor and control the remaining entities scattered across the city. The difference, Todoroki added, joining the assault with precisely aimed ice spears, is that heroes sacrifice themselves to save others, while villains sacrifice others to save themselves. The difference, Ida called out as his engines roared to maximum output, is that true authority serves those it has power over rather than the reverse. One by one, the rest of Class 1A joined the coordinated attack. Not at the entropy field, which was beyond their ability to affect, but at Dr. Holo's support systems and the philosophical poison he was trying to inject into Izuku's mind. "You think friendship conquers all?" Dr. Holo snarled, his artificial modifications making his voice echo strangely. "You think teamwork can overcome the fundamental nature of power?" "No," Izuku said quietly, and his voice carried across the battlefield with authority that belonged to both the boy he was and the king he had been. "I think you're missing the point entirely." The temporal implosion field stabilized as he achieved perfect synthesis, not of his two identities, but of his understanding of what power was really for. "You created artificial hollows because you thought I was like them, a being that existed to consume and dominate," Izuku continued, rising to his feet without losing control of the complex temporal matrix surrounding them. "But hollows aren't evil because they're powerful. They're tragic because they're empty. They consume because they've forgotten what it feels like to be fulfilled." Around him, the implosion field began to shift. Instead of simply containing the entropy effect, it was transforming it, using the breakdown of destructive forces to fuel something constructive. "I'm not the king of Mundo anymore," Izuku said with quiet certainty. "But I learned something from his memories that you never understood. True authority, real power, isn't about what you can take from others, it's about what you can give to them." "Impossible," Dr. Holo whispered, staring at his readings in disbelief. "The entropy field should be becoming a preservation field," Izuku finished. "Decay in service of life, breakdown in service of renewal, time manipulation not to prove dominance but to protect what matters." The technique that emerged was unlike anything in the theoretical literature. Instead of using temporal acceleration to age things into destruction, Izuku was using it selectively, aging the artificial bonds that held Dr. Holo's constructs together while preserving the natural structures they'd been consuming. Reality itself was being healed, repaired, made whole through the application of power that served life rather than death. "This is what I was reborn to do," Izuku said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Not to rule, but to serve. Not to take, but to give. Not to stand above others, but to lift them up." Dr. Holo's artificial modifications began to fail as the transformation field reached him. His anti-temporal protections, designed to resist destructive aging, had no defense against power that was fundamentally creative. "You don't understand," he gasped as his holo-based enhancements crumbled away, revealing the frightened man underneath. "Power corrupts, authority corrupts. You'll become what I am eventually, someone willing to sacrifice anything for knowledge, for control, for what I believe is right," Izuku asked gently. "Maybe." But the difference is that I'm not choosing what I believe is right alone. He gestured to his classmates, who were maintaining their positions in the temporal network despite the physical and mental strain of such prolonged connection. I'm choosing alongside people who challenge me, support me, and won't let me forget what really matters, he continued. That's not weakness, that's the difference between a king and a hero. The preservation field reached its full expression, washing over the entire downtown area in waves of restorative temporal energy. Buildings aged backwards to structural integrity. Dissolved matter reformed from component atoms. Even the air itself seemed cleaner, lighter, freed from the oppressive weight of artificial entropy. And at the center of it all, Izuku stood with the confident posture of someone who had finally understood the difference between power and authority, between dominance and service, between ruling others and lifting them up. Dr. Holo collapsed as the last of his modifications failed, his artificial holo constructs dissolving like smoke in the morning sun. Around the city, emergency responders reported the same phenomenon, entities simply fading away as the technology that created them aged past functionality. It's over, Izuku said quietly, letting the preservation field fade to manageable levels. All of it. But even as he spoke, he could feel the cost of what he'd accomplished. His reflection in Dr. Holo's abandoned mirrors showed a young man who looked like he'd aged a decade in the space of an hour. Gray in his hair, lines around his eyes, hands that showed the wear of years he'd never actually lived. Midoriya, Uraraka reached him first, her face showing concern and admiration in equal measure. Are you okay? I'm fine, he said, and meant it despite the physical changes. Better than fine, actually. Because for the first time since discovering his reincarnation, he felt completely at peace with who he was. Not Midoriya Izuku pretending not to be Baraggan Louis Saint-Bern or vice versa, but someone new, someone who had learned from the failures of the past to build something better in the present. Medical assessment, came All Might's voice through the calm, professional concern overlaying paternal worry. Accelerated aging, approximately 8 to 10 years of cellular development, Izuku replied honestly. But no structural damage, no loss of function. The cost was worth it. The hell it was, Bakugo said with characteristic bluntness. You look like you went through a time machine, Deku. Maybe I did, Izuku smiled, testing the way his slightly older face felt. But I came out the other side as someone I can be proud of. As emergency responders moved in to secure Dr. Holo and assess the downtown area, Izuku found himself surrounded by his classmates, not in the protective formation they'd used during combat, but in the easy circle of people who cared about each other. So what happens now? Todoroki asked with his characteristic directness. Now we go back to school, Izuku said simply. We train, we learn, we help people. Same as always. Even looking like you could be our homeroom teacher, Uraraka asked with gentle teasing. Especially then, someone has to prove that heroes aren't defined by their age or their appearance or their power level. He looked around at his friends, at the teammates who'd helped him find the balance he'd been searching for. They're defined by their choices. As they loaded into the evacuation helicopters, Izuku caught sight of his reflection one more time in the aircraft's window. The face looking back at him was older, more weathered, marked by experiences that belonged to both of his lifetimes. But for the first time, it looked like someone he could be proud to be. The king of Hueco had sought immortality and found only emptiness. Midoriya Izuku had chosen mortality in service of others and found something infinitely more valuable. He'd found himself. 3 months after the downtown incident, Musu Tafu looked like a completely different city. Not because of the reconstruction, though the financial district's gleaming new buildings were impressive, but because of the subtle changes in how people moved through their daily lives. There was less tension in crowded spaces, more willingness to help strangers, a general sense that heroes were partners rather than distant protectors. Izuku noticed it most in the small things. The way elderly people no longer flinched when he walked past, the way children waved instead of staring, the way his classmates had stopped treating him like he might accidentally age them if they got too close. Temporal hero. Chronos had become a household name, but not in the way he'd expected. The interview requests are still coming in, Yaoyorozu said, settling down beside him in the UA cafeteria with a tablet full of media coordination notes. 3 more documentary crews, 2 international hero magazines, and something called Quirk Analysis Quarterly that sounds legitimately academic. Pass on all of them, Izuku replied automatically, taking a bite of his lunch. I'm not interested in being famous for having unusual powers. Even the academic journal, they're specifically interested in your preservation techniques and their applications for disaster relief. That gave him pause. The preservation field methodology they developed after the Dr. Holo incident had revolutionized emergency response protocols across Japan. Instead of just evacuating people from disasters, heroes could now create temporal bubbles that gave rescue workers subjective hours to solve problems that normally required split-second decisions. Maybe that one, he conceded, but only if they focus on the technique applications, not the personal stuff. Afraid they'll ask about the aging? Uraraka asked, joining them with her usual bright smile. The question was gentle, concerned rather than mocking. Izuku reflexively touched the gray streaks that now threaded through his green hair, a permanent reminder of the cost he'd paid to save the city. In the month since the incident, he'd grown into his prematurely aged features, but there was no hiding the fact that he looked several years older than his classmates. Not afraid, exactly. Just tired of explaining it. The truth was more complex than simple vanity. The physical aging was actually the least significant change he'd undergone. The real transformation was internal, a fundamental shift in how he understood himself and his place in the world. He was still Midoriya Izuku, still the boy who dreamed of being a hero. But he was also someone who had learned to integrate centuries of experience with 15 years of human compassion, someone who had found the balance between ancient wisdom and modern ethics. Someone who had chosen service over dominion so completely that the choice felt as natural as breathing. "Yo, Deku," Bakugo's voice cut across the cafeteria with its usual explosive energy. "You ready for this afternoon's training session?" "Which one?" Izuku asked, checking his schedule. Since the downtown incident, his training regimen had expanded beyond simple power control to include advanced tactical coordination and what Dr. Temporal euphemistically called legacy skill development. "The one with the brats," Bakugo said with a grin that managed to be both fond and slightly sadistic. "Your fan club is waiting in training ground beta." The brats were a group of middle school students with difficult or dangerous quirks, kids who'd been referred to UA's new mentorship program after displaying powers that made their families and schools nervous. It was experimental, controversial, and exactly the kind of thing Izuku found himself uniquely qualified to handle. "They're not my fan club," he protested, though he was already gathering his things. "They're students who need someone who understands what it's like to have powers that scare people." "Same thing," Uraraka said with amusement, "though I think some of them are more interested in your tactical analysis than your quirks specifically." That was true. Over the past month, Izuku had discovered that teaching came naturally to him in ways he hadn't expected. Not just the power control techniques, but the broader concepts of responsibility, restraint, and using strength in service of others rather than personal advancement. It probably helped that he looked old enough to be taken seriously by teenagers who were used to dismissing adult authority. Training Ground Beta had been modified for the mentorship program, with specialized equipment designed to handle a variety of potentially dangerous abilities in controlled environments. Today's group consisted of 6 students, each dealing with powers that conventional hero education struggled to address. "All right, everyone," Izuku said as he entered the training space, noting how the students automatically arranged themselves in a loose semicircle. "Who wants to go first today?" A girl with silver hair raised her hand hesitantly. Akemi Sato, 13 years old, quirk designation, entropy touch. Everything she came into direct skin contact with began to break down at the molecular level, similar to Dr. Holo's artificial entities, but completely natural and impossible to control consciously. "I practiced the meditation exercises you showed us," she said quietly, "but I'm still afraid to touch anything without gloves." "That's completely understandable," Izuku replied, settling into what had become his natural teaching posture, relaxed but attentive, approachable but clearly experienced. "Fear of your own power is normal when that power could hurt people. But let me ask you something. When you're meditating, focusing on the sensation of your quirk without activating it, what does it feel like?" Akemi considered the question seriously. Like something waiting, not hungry or angry, just patient." "Good, that patience is important. Powers that involve breakdown or decay aren't inherently destructive, they're transformative. The question is whether you're transforming things intentionally or just letting the transformation happen randomly." He demonstrated by placing his palm on a metal training dummy and creating a small, controlled temporal field around the point of contact. Under his influence, the metal didn't crumble or dissolve. It aged in a very specific pattern, developing a patina that actually made it more resistant to certain kinds of damage. Your quirk breaks things down, but breakdown isn't the same as destruction, he continued. Sometimes breaking things down is the first step to building them back up stronger. Another student, a boy with the ability to generate localized gravity wells, raised his hand. But what if we make mistakes? What if we hurt someone by accident? Then you learn from the mistake, make sure it doesn't happen again, and keep working to get better, Izuku said simply. I've made plenty of mistakes with my quirk. Some of them had serious consequences, but the alternative, never using your abilities at all, actually safer. It just means you never learn to use them properly. He gestured to the specialized training equipment around them. That's why we practice in controlled environments, with safety systems and people who understand what you're dealing with, so you can make mistakes safely and learn from them. What followed was an hour of carefully supervised practice, with each student working on specific control exercises designed for their individual needs. Izuku moved between them, offering guidance that drew on both his recent training experience and Baraggan's centuries of understanding how power worked on a fundamental level. But more than technique, he found himself teaching philosophy. Power doesn't make you responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world, he told a girl whose empathy-based quirk let her feel everyone's pain within a half-mile radius. But it does make you responsible for choosing how to use that power constructively. The strength to destroy something doesn't make you evil, he assured a boy whose sonic abilities could level buildings. What matters is what you choose to do with that strength. Being afraid of your own abilities is smart, he said to a student whose mutation gave her the appearance of a classic movie monster. Fear keeps you cautious, but don't let it keep you from becoming who you want to be. By the end of the session, all 6 students were working with more confidence and control than when they'd started. Not perfect, that would take months or years of training, but measurably improved. Same time next week, Akemi asked as they prepared to leave. Wouldn't miss it, Izuku replied with genuine warmth. And remember, practice the meditation exercises, but don't be afraid to test your limits in safe environments. Growth requires some risk. After the students left, Izuku found himself alone in the training ground, reflecting on how different his life had become from what he'd imagined just a year ago. He'd wanted to be a hero who saved people, and he was doing that. But he was also becoming something he'd never expected: a teacher, a mentor, someone who helped others understand the responsibility that came with unusual power. You're good at this. Izuku turned to find Aizawa leaning against the doorframe, his expression showing approval that was rare and therefore valuable. At training, Izuku asked. At teaching. At helping kids who remind you of yourself find better paths than the ones you had to take. Aizawa entered the training space, his trained eye automatically assessing the equipment and safety protocols. The mentorship program wasn't my idea, but watching you work with these students. It's obvious this is something you were meant to do. It feels natural, Izuku admitted. More natural than I expected anyway, probably because you understand what it's like to be afraid of your own power and what it takes to move beyond that fear. Aizawa's expression was thoughtful. Most pro heroes develop their abilities gradually, with family support and conventional training programs. You had to figure out control and ethics simultaneously under extreme pressure. I had help, Izuku pointed out. A lot of help. Yes, you did, and now you're passing that help along to the next generation. Aizawa paused, then added quietly, that's not something everyone would think to do. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Class 1A, fresh from their own advanced training session and looking for their classmate. There you are, Todoroki said with his characteristic directness. We were starting to think you've been adopted by the middle schoolers. They're good kids, Izuku replied, beginning to pack up the training equipment. Just need someone who understands what they're dealing with. Speaking of understanding, Bakugo said with suspicious casualness, Uraraka wants to talk to you about something. Something important, apparently. Izuku looked around for the gravity girl and found her standing slightly apart from the group, her expression nervous but determined. When their eyes met, she gestured toward the exit with a meaningful look. I'll catch up with you guys later, Izuku told the rest of the class, following Uraraka out into the evening air. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, making their way toward the small garden area behind the dormitories. It was a peaceful spot, with carefully maintained plants and a small fountain that had become a popular study location for students who preferred quiet environments. So, Uraraka said once they'd settled on one of the benches, I wanted to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a while. Okay, Izuku replied, trying to read her expression. She looked nervous but not distressed, determined but not confrontational. Do you remember what you said after the Dr. Holo incident, about how heroes are defined by their choices rather than their appearance or age? Yes. Well, I've been thinking about choices a lot lately. About the ones I've made and the ones I want to make going forward. She turned to face him directly, her brown eyes serious but warm. And I've realized that one of the most important choices I want to make is about you. Izuku felt his heart start to beat faster. What do you mean? I mean that over the past year, watching you grow into your power and figure out who you want to be, I've realized that I care about you. Not just as a classmate or a friend, but as someone I want to be with. Someone I want to support and be supported by. The words hit him like a physical impact, surprising in their directness but warming in their sincerity. Uraraka, he began, but she held up a hand. Let me finish. I know this might seem weird, with everything you've been through and all the ways you've changed. And I know that dating might be complicated for someone who looks older than he actually is. She smiled, and it was bright and genuine and completely without reservation. But I don't care about any of that. I care about you, about who you choose to be every day, about how you use your power to help people, about the way you make everyone around you better just by being yourself. Izuku stared at her for a long moment, processing words he'd hoped to hear but never quite believed he deserved. You're sure? He asked quietly. Because I come with a lot of complications, memories that aren't quite mine, responsibilities I'm still figuring out, and a face that makes me look like I could be your older brother. I'm sure, she said with absolute conviction. Besides, if we're talking about complications, I float when I get too excited. At least your quirk doesn't make you accidentally drift toward the ceiling during romantic moments. Despite everything, the weight of responsibility, the physical changes, the complexity of integrating 2 lifetimes of experience, Izuku found himself laughing. Not the nervous laughter of someone deflecting discomfort, but the genuine joy of someone who had found something unexpectedly wonderful. In that case, he said, reaching for her hand with careful control of his temporal field, I'd like that very much. Her smile could have powered the entire campus. 6 months later, Izuku stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his hero costume for the official debut of Temporal Hero, Chronos. The design was a collaboration between him, the support department, and a team of professional costume designers who specialized in heroes with unusual abilities. It was primarily deep blue and silver, with temporal stabilization equipment integrated so seamlessly into the fabric that it looked like decorative elements rather than safety gear. But what he noticed most was his reflection. The gray in his hair had settled into distinguished streaks rather than patches, and the lines around his eyes had softened into something that suggested wisdom rather than premature aging. He looked like a young man who had experienced more than his years normally allowed, but who had grown stronger rather than bitter because of it. You ready for this? Uraraka asked, appearing in the doorway with her own hero costume freshly pressed and a smile that still made his heart skip beats. As ready as anyone can be for their first official patrol, he replied, turning away from the mirror. Though I still think Chronos sounds a little pretentious. It sounds mysterious and powerful, which is exactly what people need to see from someone with your abilities, she corrected. Besides, it was either that or Temporal King, and we both agreed that had some unfortunate implications. That was true. The marketing team had gone through dozens of potential hero names before settling on one that conveyed authority without suggesting dominance. They made their way to the common room, where the rest of Class 1A was gathered for the traditional send-off that had become customary when one of their classmates achieved full hero certification. About time, Bakugo said with his usual explosive grin. I was starting to think you were going to spend the rest of your life teaching middle schoolers instead of doing actual hero work. The mentorship program is actual hero work, Izuku protested, but he was smiling. Just a different kind. Both kinds are important, Ida added with formal precision. Direct intervention in crisis situations and educational prevention programs serve complementary functions in maintaining social stability. Speaking of crisis situations, Todoroki said, checking his phone, there's been an incident downtown. Multiple agencies responding, but initial reports suggest it might be something that requires temporal manipulation expertise. Izuku felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the prospect of people in danger, but also the steady confidence that had developed over months of training and experience. What kind of incident? He asked, already mentally running through response protocols. Building collapse, but the structure is falling in slow motion. Some kind of quirk effect that's making it impossible for conventional rescue teams to predict impact zones or evacuation timing. It sounded like exactly the type of situation his abilities were designed to address, complex temporal manipulation that required both power and precision. Sounds like Chronos is needed, Eureka said with pride in her voice. Sounds like we're needed, Izuku corrected automatically. I'm not doing this alone. The response from his classmates was immediate and unanimous, nods of agreement, expressions of determination, the easy readiness of people who had trained together so long that coordinated response was second nature. As they headed for the exit, Izuku caught sight of a group of middle school students watching from the common room windows. His current mentorship group, who had been invited to observe the departure as part of their education about hero work. He waved to them and saw Acme mouth good luck through the glass. The thought struck him that this was what legacy really looked like, not the grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices that made headlines, but the quiet work of helping others understand that power could be used to serve rather than dominate. That strength was measured by what you lifted up rather than what you could tear down. "You coming, Deku?" Bakugo called from the transport vehicle. "People need saving, and you're the only one weird enough to make falling buildings fall more sensibly." "On my way," Izuku replied, jogging toward the vehicle where his friends, his team, his family, and everything but blood were waiting. As they drove through the city toward whatever crisis awaited them, Izuku reflected on the path that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been terrified of his own power, convinced that having abilities meant being dangerous. 6 months ago, he'd been struggling to integrate the memories of an ancient king with the values of a modern hero. Now, he was simply someone who had learned to use unusual gifts in service of others, supported by people who trusted him and guided by principles he'd chosen for himself. The king of Mundo had sought to prove his supremacy over time and death, and had died alone, forgotten, full of regrets about chances not taken and choices not made. Midoriya Izuku had learned that true authority came not from ruling others, but from serving them. That the greatest power wasn't the ability to take what you wanted, but the wisdom to give what was needed. As their vehicle approached the incident site, a building frozen in temporal stasis, rescue workers coordinating around its base, civilians watching with the kind of hope that came from knowing heroes were on the way, Izuku felt a deep satisfaction settle into his chest. This was what he'd been reborn to do, not to rule but to serve, not to dominate but to protect, not to prove his strength but to use it wisely. And surrounded by friends who had helped him find the balance between power and principle, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. "All right, team," he said as they prepared to disembark, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found his purpose. "Let's go save some people." The last thing he saw before stepping out into the organized chaos of emergency response was his reflection in the vehicle's window, older than his chronological age, marked by experiences that belonged to 2 lifetimes, but smiling with the genuine contentment of someone who had learned that a king's greatest power wasn't ruling others. It was serving them, and that was a lesson worth whatever it had cost to learn. 5 years later, Principal Midoriya looked up from the stack of training reports on his desk as a knock echoed through his office door. "Come in," he called, setting aside the evaluation of a particularly promising student whose quirk involved manipulating probability fields. The door opened to reveal a nervous-looking teenager with green hair and freckles that looked remarkably familiar. Principal Midoriya, I'm Yuki Sato. I was told you wanted to see me about my application to the hero course." Izuku smiled, studying the young man who reminded him so much of his younger self, nervous but determined, clearly intelligent but struggling with self-confidence. "Please sit down, and it's Izuku or Chronos if you prefer the formal title. I'm not much older than you are, regardless of appearances." The student settled into the chair across from his desk, clutching a portfolio that probably contained analyses of hero fights and detailed notes about quirk applications. "Your application essay mentioned some unusual circumstances regarding your quirk manifestation," Izuku continued gently. "Late development, unexpected complexity, some difficulty with control." "Yes, sir." "I mean, Izuku-sensei, I mean." The student took a deep breath and tried again. "My quirk didn't appear until I was 14, and when it did, it came with these weird memories that don't feel like mine. Like I was someone else before I was me." Izuku leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tell me," he said with the patience of someone who had learned that the most important lessons often came from the most unexpected places. "What do these memories tell you about responsibility?" Outside his office window, UA's training grounds buzzed with the activity of another generation learning to use their gifts in service of others. And in the distance, barely visible through the late afternoon light, A small shrine stood where the old training ground Beta used to be, a memorial not to the king of Hueco who had died, but to the lesson he had learned too late. True power serves, true authority lifts others up. True kingship is measured not by what you can take, but by what you choose to give. It was a lesson Izuku planned to keep teaching for as long as he lived, however long that might be. Holy crap, what a ride! From that terrifying first robot encounter to Principal Midoriya mentoring kids with dangerous quirks, watching someone choose service over domination while wielding the power of a literal king. That's the good stuff right there. That preservation field scene still gives me chills, taking the most destructive power in Bleach and turning it into something that saves lives, pure genius. Drop a comment with your favorite scene. I'm betting half of you loved the Dr. Holo showdown, and the other half are still emotional about that Eureka confession scene. Subscribe for more What If the Overpowered Villain Became the Hero content, and seriously, tell me what crossover you want next. Later.